Chapter 86. General Hu still wanted to exonerate his daughter, but Lu Hinti added, "If Minister Hu doesn't believe me, those criminals are still being held in the Supreme Court. Minister Lan of the Supreme Court has several pieces of evidence, enough to prove that your daughter is the mastermind behind this case." General Hu choked and was speechless. No one doubted the ability of the Supreme Court's Minister Lan Yufeng. He was comparable to the famous Bao Qingtian. No difficult case could not be solved in his hands. Moreover, he was impartial and selfless, not giving face to anyone. He only asked about the case and did not look at the person. In his hands there had never been a case of injustice. Since it was his investigation, General Hu really had nothing to say. What's more, he knew his daughter's true temperament. Because she was poor when she was young, she hated Ning Xuema the most. She hated Ning Xuema to the point of wanting to kill her. It was entirely possible that she would plot against her in secret. He could only say, "Your Majesty, my daughter did indeed make a mistake, but that was because she was impulsive. She did not harm Ning Xuema's life, but instead died in her hands. Thinking about it, my daughter suffered a loss. Forget it. Ning Xuema is after all the daughter of Marquis Jingyuan, and Marquis Jingyuan has promoted this humble subject. For the sake of Marquis Jingyuan, this humble subject will not pursue Ning Xuema." At this time he could only show his magnanimity. Lu Hinti secretly let out a sigh of relief and glanced at General Hu. Right now he was his right-hand man, so he could not let him be too bitterly disappointed. It is good that General Hu is so reasonable. Jean is relieved. How about this? Jean cannot let your daughter suffer too much, so Jean will let Yun Hao take your daughter as his official consort. Although Ning Xuema was also at fault, her crimes are gone. Old Sixth also wronged her, so let Old Sixth also take her as his concubine. They were once good sisters, but because of some misunderstandings they ended up like this. Now that they are both Old Sixth's wives and concubines, I hope they can smile and forget their enmity in the netherworld and be good sisters again. Lu Hinti deserved to be called the Emperor. His method of playing with people was brilliant. His method of giving a sweet date after a slap had reached the point of perfection. Even the victim, General Hu, couldn't say anything else after hearing his last words. He was very grateful. In any case, his daughter was already dead. It would be good to win her the title of princess consort. After all, that girl surnamed Ning was destined to be a concubine. Even if she died, she would have to bow down to his daughter. Ji Yunhao didn't have any objections. Ning Xuema's figure flashed through his mind. That little girl was his in the end. Even if she died, she would be his concubine and wouldn't belong to anyone else. This kind of ending was actually quite good. He bowed and was about to agree when Ji Yunhuang, who had been watching from the side, suddenly said, "Wait. Imperial Father, there's something fishy about this matter. We can't just let it go like this." Lu Hinti and Ji Yunhao stared blankly at him. Lu Hinti frowned slightly. "Huang this matter is already so clear. What other fishy things are there?" Ji Yunhuang shook the testimonial and suicide note in his hand and said indifferently, "Hu Daichong did indeed frame Ning Xuema, but her death has nothing to do with Ning Xuema." As soon as these words came out, everyone's expression changed. Lu Hinti said, "Huang Imperial Father knows that you have always been fair and selfless. You don't want a little girl to be wronged, so you protect her. However, her testimonial and suicide note is clearly written here. If you continue to say this, it's a little..." Chapter 87. This suicide note and confession aren't hers. Ji Yunhuang interrupted Lu Hinti. "At first glance, this handwriting looks very similar, but it can't escape my eyes. These things are clearly written by someone who imitated her handwriting. If Imperial Father doesn't believe me, you can summon Lord Lan and let him verify the authenticity of these things." Lu Hinti was speechless. He didn't expect that the suicide note and confession would be forged. At this time he naturally couldn't refute his son. He could only send someone to summon Lan Yufeng from the Supreme Court. Not long after, Lan Yufeng quickly walked into the imperial study. After greeting everyone present, Lu Hinti directly handed over Ning Xuema's confession and suicide note to him for verification. Ji Yunhuang was obviously prepared. He also handed over the purchase list that Ning Xuema usually wrote. Lan Yufeng looked at it for a moment and said with certainty that the confession and suicide note were fake. Lu Hinti's expression was very ugly. He didn't expect that the Ministry of Justice would dare to give him a fake confession. He immediately sent someone to summon the Minister of Justice. When the Minister of Justice, Lord Lu, arrived and heard Lu Hinti's interrogation, he also cried out that he was wrongly accused. He said that the confession was personally presented by someone from the prison. The crime of deceiving the monarch was no small matter. Thus, the imperial guards were ordered to capture the 4 prison guards from the Ministry of Justice's prison. The 4 prison guards had already prepared a confession that day. They said that the suicide note and confession were personally interrogated by Tui Dao, and that they were only responsible for handing it over. Tui Dao had already drowned. As for Ning Xuema, the 4 prison guards insisted that they had already burned her corpse under Tui Dao's orders. Since these confessions were fake, then Hu Diechong's murderer might not be Ning Xuema. Lu Hinti could only reprimand the Minister of Justice, Lord Lu, and then transfer the case to the Supreme Court Chancellor, giving him a deadline to solve the case. Lu Hinti was also tired. Just as he was about to order everyone to kneel down, Ji Yunhuang stepped forward and said, "Imperial Father, there's no need for Minister Lan to set a time limit to solve this case. This son has already secretly investigated this matter. I can get to the bottom of this matter right now." Ji Yunhao's expression changed slightly. Lu Hinti's heart stirred. He looked at Ji Yunhuang and asked, "What do you want to do?" Ji Yunhuang said, "Imperial Father, please move to Wu Men. There are a bunch of evidence and witnesses regarding Miss Hu's death there. When we get there, Imperial Father will be able to find out the truth." Lu Hinti frowned slightly. He had already achieved his goal. He didn't really care about the real cause of Hu Diechong's death. However, since the matter had developed to this point, he could only continue with the investigation. Ji Yunhao stepped forward and said, "Imperial Father, since there is something fishy about this case, I'm afraid that it won't be solved in a short period of time. Why don't we hand over this case and the witnesses to Minister Lan? After Minister Lan has finished his investigation, he will give Imperial Father an explanation. Why bother Imperial Father to personally go there?" These words were said in a dignified manner. Lu Hinti deeply agreed. He was the emperor. If he personally presided over the case, it would be beneath his status. He was about to agree. Ji Yunhuang had already bowed and said, "Imperial Father, this matter implicates Miss Ning's reputation. It also implicates the cause of Marshal Hu's beloved daughter's death. For the sake of Marquis Jingyuan and General Hu, please personally oversee the case. This case isn't complicated. Imperial Father will quickly understand." Since Ji Yunhuang had already said this, General Hu was also anxious to find out the real culprit behind his daughter's death. He also added a few sentences and requested Lu Hinti to preside over the case. Lu Hinti had no choice but to agree. Ji Yunhao's eyes flashed slightly. He stood up and said, "Imperial Father, this son still has matters to attend to today. I will take my leave first." Chapter 88. Before he could finish speaking, Ji Yunhuang smiled and interrupted him. "Sixth brother, this matter is somewhat related to you. After all, those 2 women are more or less related to you. Don't tell me you don't want to find the real culprit behind Hu Diechong's death?" Ji Yunhao's hand was held by Ji Yunhuang, and he was unable to free himself. He could only smile. "Of course I want to, but I have something urgent to deal with. Don't worry, it won't take up too much of your time. The truth will come to light within an hour." Ji Yunhao didn't have anything else to say, and could only follow along. The others naturally followed behind them, and they quickly arrived at the Meridian Gate. Outside the Meridian Gate, there were already a few people waiting in the side hall. When they saw the emperor, they all knelt down to welcome him. Those people were the best coroners in the vast sky country. These were not the strangest things. The strangest thing was that there was a coffin in the side hall. When General Hu saw the coffin, he stared blankly for a moment. Suddenly, he rushed forward and pushed open the coffin to take a look. His face was as heavy as iron as he looked at Ji Yunhuang. "Crown Prince, why did you bring my daughter's coffin here?" His daughter's coffin was clearly placed in the Marshal's mansion's morning hall. Ji Yunhuang glanced at him and said concisely, "General, don't you want to know the truth behind your daughter's death?" His words made General Hu shut his mouth. He was still extremely wary of this crown prince. Ji Yunhao, who was standing to the side, looked at Ji Yunhuang with a deep gaze. He did not expect that Ji Yunhuang would secretly accomplish so many things in such a short time. Didn't this crown prince return to his mansion immediately after leaving the palace? Seems like he ordered someone to do it. Ji Yunhao secretly sent people to observe the movements in the crown prince's mansion, but his people did not find out anything. Looking at his imperial father's expression, it was obvious that he did not know either. It seems like the power behind his third brother's back was very deep. Ji Yunhao's face was slightly pale and his fingers were clenched so tightly that they turned white. Although his heart was somewhat flustered, he could not say anything. His gaze turned and suddenly fell on the child that Ji Yunhuang brought in. The child had a small and thin stature, and he stood behind Ji Yunhuang. Ever since he came in, he had been quiet and well-behaved, as if he was invisible. His presence was very low, and almost no one noticed him. Ji Yunhao hadn't noticed it at first, but now that he saw it, his heart suddenly stirred. He faintly felt that this child's figure was somewhat familiar, but he couldn't remember where he had seen him before. Yunhuang often had some strange people by his side. Furthermore, Ji Yunhao was already feeling uneasy, so he only glanced at the child once before shifting his gaze away. That manservant had his head slightly lowered the entire time, but he seemed to have sensed Ji Yunhao's gaze. At this moment, the corners of his mouth curled up slightly, faintly revealing a trace of a smile. It was unknown whether it was ridicule or ridicule. Ji Yunhao looked at the coffin and frowned. Young miss whose precious body, how can it be exposed in front of others like this? Third brother's actions are too rash. Even Ji Yunhuang's voice was indifferent. This case is a murder case, and it even implicated Marquis Jingyuan's orphan daughter. Naturally, this is no small matter. If the imperial court did not get to the bottom of this, how could they face the spirit of Marquis Jingyuan? Are you worthy of the people's trust in the imperial court? These words once again left Ji Yunhao speechless. Luhinti tried to smooth things over. Since this is to investigate the truth behind young Miss Hu's death, General Hu should not be too concerned about this matter. Alright, Huang where is your so-called truth? Chapter 89. Ji Yunhuang beckoned General Hu to come closer to the coffin. General Hu, please take a look. Is your daughter's current appearance the same as when she was killed? General Hu had already seen it clearly and nodded. Correct. His daughter's eyes were wide open and her small mouth was slightly open. There was a thin blade in her chest, right above her heart. Ji Yunhao coldly interrupted. There was a blade in Daishang's chest. This is the fatal wound. And this blade is very similar to the one Ning Shuama used. Ji Yunhuang ignored him and called the coroner forward. Examine the body. The coroner was worthy of being called a gold medal coroner. His movements were swift and nimble. He first carefully examined the corpse's face. Then his hands quickly moved over the corpse. First, he pulled out the blade and looked at the wound on the corpse. Then, he looked at the blade in his hand and said, "There is not much blood around the wound. The flesh is red and dark." He said a string of terms and finally said, "From the above points, it can be inferred that this blade was inserted after the victim was killed. The wound here is not the fatal wound. A stone raises 1,000 ripples." Everyone's face slightly changed. General Hu clenched his fists tightly. He also went forward to examine the wound. The characteristics were indeed the same as what the coroner said. Since this wound is not the fatal wound, then where is the fatal wound? General Hu's voice was like ice. The coroner examined for a while and thought for a moment. Suddenly, his finger gently touched the hair on Hu Daishang's forehead. After carefully sensing it, his eyes suddenly lit up. It's here. General Hu also carefully looked. That place was originally the place where the hair grew. He did not see anything unusual. General Hu, please use 30% of your psychokinesis to absorb it. The coroner saluted. Although General Hu was full of doubts, he still followed the coroner's instructions and placed his hand on his daughter's hair. A moment later, a strand of 3 strands of hair was pulled out by General Hu inch by inch from Dai Chang's hair. That strand of hair was covered in blood and was nearly a foot long. It laid horizontally on General Hu's palm and looked very shocking. And at the place where Hu Daishang pulled out the hair, a line of blood slowly flowed out. Without the coroner saying anything, everyone knew that this strand of hair was the fatal wound that killed Hu Daishang. She could actually kill people with such soft hair. Such soft hair had penetrated nearly a foot deep into the deceased's head, directly destroying the vital parts of the deceased's head, but it was not visible from the outside. What a brilliant and insidious way of killing. It seemed that the person who did this was not only a psychokinesis expert, but also a meticulous person. Ji Yunhuang looked at Lu Hinti and said, "Imperial Father, this thing is the real culprit behind Hu Diechang's death. It must be a psychokinesis master who is close to the head of the deceased and suddenly exerts force to produce this effect. As for Ning Xuema, we all know that she doesn't have psychokinesis. Can this prove that she is innocent?" Lu Hinti didn't say anything, but Ji Yunhao snorted again. This only proves that she didn't act directly. What if she secretly sent an expert? After all, Daichang hasn't offended anyone yet. And Ning Xuema just received 2,000 taels of gold from this prince, so she can hire someone to kill. After this explanation, everyone couldn't help but nod, feeling that it made sense. Ji Yunhuang chuckled. What sixth brother said is not impossible. But sixth brother seems to have forgotten something. To be able to use this method to kill, there must be two conditions. Chapter 90. First, to get close to Hu Daichang when she least expected it. Second, the person who did it must have a psychokinesis of at least human realm rank 7. In vast Sky Empire, there are only a handful of people with such high psychokinesis, and they are all talented people with high positions. Would such a person kill someone for 1 or 2,000 taels of gold? Taking a step back, even if there is such a person who only covets money and doesn't want to be an official, Ning Xuema had already spent 1,500 taels of gold before she met Hu Daichang. She only has 500 taels left. Even if she took it all out, who would risk being chased by the entire vast Sky Empire to assassinate a marshal's daughter for 500 taels of gold? Everyone was stumped by this question. Lan Yufeng, the official from the Supreme Court, also said in a low voice, "According to what I know, if any telekinesis experts above the 7th level of the vast Sky Empire work as assassins, they are all in the most famous assassin organization, the Blood Oath Alliance. The lowest reward for their missions is 2,800 taels of gold per mission. If they assassinate a marshal's daughter, the reward should be higher." Lan Yufeng was very clear about the affairs of the various sects in vast Sky Empire, so no one would doubt his words. Lu Hinti nodded. It seems that Ning Xuema hired someone to kill her daughter is not valid. Then who is the real murderer? Huang didn't you say that you've almost finished investigating? Ji Yunhuang bowed and said, "Imperial Father, before that, please allow the boy beside me to do an experiment for everyone." Everyone's gaze landed on the boy who had been following Ji Yunhuang all this time. The boy looked to be around 11 or 12 years old. His body was small and thin, and his face seemed to be wearing a mask. He was stiff and expressionless. He had been quietly standing by Ji Yunhuang's side the whole time, but now he slowly walked out. Lu Hinti glanced at him but didn't find it strange. Ji Yunhuang often had all kinds of strange people around him, and there was no lack of boys among them. As long as it wasn't harmful to the imperial family, Lu Hinti would turn a blind eye to it. At this moment his gaze fell on the boy. "What kind of experiment do you want to do for everyone?" The boy said, "Experiment with a safe distance." As soon as he finished speaking, his figure turned, and in the blink of an eye, he appeared in front of Ji Yunhao. The distance between them was about 3 feet. Ji Yunhao jumped in fright and subconsciously took a big step back. "What are you doing?" The boy ignored him and turned around again. He stopped in front of the Supreme Court Chancellor Lan Yufeng and the Assistant Minister Lu of the Ministry of Justice. They were less than 4 feet apart. Those people also subconsciously retreated, putting some distance between them and him. Only then did the boy stop. "Your Majesty, as you can see, I am a stranger to these people. If a stranger comes within 3 feet of me, I will subconsciously avoid them. Only when I am 4 feet away will I feel more at ease." This statement was novel to these people, but it was also very effective. His experiment was right in front of them. Everyone thought about how they usually acted when they interacted with other people and nodded. The boy continued. Miss Hu was killed by someone in front of her. Moreover, to use this kind of martial arts, He had to first press his hand near her forehead, and then make a move when she least expected it. The distance between them was less than an arm's length. Who could be so close to Miss Hu and catch her off guard? Everyone thought about this distance and then thought about the distance between themselves and the people around them. Because this case clearly showed that Ning Shuama had nothing to do with it, Lord Liu, who was in charge of arresting Ning Shuama, was very uncertain. At this time he was also anxious to make a contribution, so he immediately replied, "It's a lover, wife, concubine, or child." Chapter 91. The boy nodded. That's right. Only the person closest to her would be able to get close to her and catch her off guard. Miss Hu is still unmarried and naturally has no children. Thus, the only possibility is that she is a lover. This kind of inference obviously had a hidden meaning. Almost everyone's eyes were focused on the sixth prince Ji Yunhao. He was Hu Diechong's lover and had a psychokinesis above level 7. Who else could it be other than Ji Yunhao? General Hu's eyes were almost spitting fire as he stared at Ji Yunhao. Sixth prince, how do you explain this? Ji Yunhao's face was slightly pale, but he couldn't help but sneer. He's talking nonsense. Hu Diechong's psychokinesis is average. Anyone with a high psychokinesis can get close to her. If such an expert instantly got close to her and took the opportunity to attack, she wouldn't be able to escape. The boy smiled. The sixth prince's explanation is reasonable, but the sixth prince seems to have forgotten one thing. Come, everyone can take a look at Miss Hu's expression before she died. He pulled Lan Yufeng closer to the coffin. Lord Lan often deals with cases and has seen many expressions of the victims before they died. Lord Lan, please take a look at Miss Hu's expression. Lan Yufeng looked at it for a moment and commented, "It's an expression of shock and disbelief." In Lord Lan's opinion, if the victim saw a stranger attacking her, would she be shocked and disbelieving or fearful? Fearful. Lan Yufeng replied. He pondered for a moment. Miss Hu's expression before she died proves that the person who killed her was someone she was familiar with. Moreover, she would never have thought that the other party would attack her. The boy clapped his hands. That's it. Then I don't need to point out who the murderer is, right? Which one of the people present wasn't a clever person? They naturally understood after thinking about it. Their gazes towards Ji Yunhao were full of suspicion and condemnation. General Hu clenched his fists again and again. Suddenly, he knelt on the ground and kowtowed to Lu Hinti. "Your Majesty, my daughter died unjustly. Your Majesty, please uphold justice for my daughter." Lu Hinti's face also sank. "Old Six, what's going on?" Ji Yunhao clenched his fists in his sleeves. "I'm innocent. Father, even if I meet all the conditions, what's the reason for me to kill her? She and I are in love with each other. I can't wait to pamper her, so how can I bear to kill her? There is something fishy about this matter. Father, please investigate this matter." Lu Hinti nodded slightly. He also felt that what Ji Yunhao said was reasonable. His gaze couldn't help but fall on the boy. Fairychild's deduction is naturally irrefutable, but Old Sixth really has no reason to kill Hu Diechong. He came here today to ask you to make Hu Diechong his official consort. He has deep feelings for her, so why would he kill her? This matter cannot be justified. Luxian Emperor was already very polite to the boy. On this continent, no one dared to look down on the boy. This was especially true for the clever, and mysterious children who had special abilities. Many of these children were disciples of the venerable sovereign, so their status was noble, and they were treated even better than the first-ranked ministers of various countries. Occasionally, a boy would appear by Ji Yunhuang's side, and these boys were all from the Sun Moon sect. When Ning Shuama cried out for justice in the public square, she had alarmed the venerable sovereign, and the venerable sovereign had sent a boy to uphold justice. Could it be that the venerable sovereign still hadn't forgotten about that little girl, and specially sent a boy to investigate this case? Lu Hinti's heart suddenly became nervous. Chapter 92. Lu Hinti's heart suddenly became nervous. With this boy here, even if he wanted to be biased, he wouldn't dare. Lu Hinti looked at the boy with a complicated gaze. The boy didn't seem to notice as he faintly smiled. His face was covered by a mask, so even when he smiled, his face was expressionless. However, everyone felt that his smile was actually quite good-looking and very likable. Ji Yunhao's heart felt as if it was hooked by a hook. He suddenly felt that this smile was very familiar. Just as he was about to think about it, the boy's next words struck him like a bolt of lightning. "Your Highness the Crown Prince, you can ask the midwives to come on stage." A midwife was a woman who specialized in helping women deliver babies and take care of miscarriages. These people had rich experience in childbirth. A high-level midwife could accurately determine a woman's pregnancy by observing the size and shape of the pregnant woman's belly. Ji Yunhuang was clearly well prepared. After obtaining Lu Hinti's approval, he sent someone to find the midwives who had been waiting outside the palace. The two women who came in were the most famous midwives in Chongkong country. One of them had even helped a concubine in the palace give birth before. Under Ji Yunhuang's instructions, the two midwives went forward to carefully examine Hu Daichang. After the time it took for a stick of incense to burn, the two midwives replied with certainty, "Miss Hu is already around 50 days pregnant." The other midwife was even more specific. Around 49 days. When the two midwives said the date, everyone's expression changed. General Hu was stunned for a moment before he suddenly roared, "Nonsense! How can it be around 50 days? The boy smiled faintly. "If Miss Hu's child is the sixth princess, then it can't be around 50 days pregnant. Because the sixth prince had some matters to attend to 2 months ago, and only returned a month ago. In other words, if the child was Ji Yunhao's, then the child was either 2 months pregnant or less than a month old. There was only one possibility for this to happen. This Miss Hu had an affair during this period of time, and made Ji Yunhao wear a green hat." That boy's gaze coldly fell on Ji Yunhao's face. Sixth prince. That day at the tea house, Ning Xuema inadvertently revealed Miss Hu's pregnancy date. "It should have aroused your suspicions, right? That's why I secretly sent people to investigate. Your guards aren't useless, they're very useful at crucial moments." Not only did they find out that Hu Daichang had an affair, they even found out who her adulterer was. You flew into a rage out of humiliation. On one hand, you secretly sent people to kill that adulterer. On the other hand, you went to find Hu Daichang to settle the score. While you were testing her with words, you wanted to kill her. That was why you killed her and tried to frame Ning Xuema. Ji Yunhao inwardly clenched his teeth and said, "This is only a mortal child's conjecture. Without any evidence, it's hard to believe." The boy's lips curled up slightly. "It seems that the sixth prince won't shed tears until he sees the coffin. He won't give up until he reaches the Yellow River. All right, then I'll convince the sixth prince." He glanced at Ji Yunhuang and said, "Your Highness, you can let the other witnesses enter the court now. There are other witnesses." Ji Yunhao's expression became even more unsightly. However, with the immortal child present, no one could stop the situation from developing. Very quickly, 3 people were escorted into the side chamber. 2 men and 1 woman. When Ji Yunhao saw these 3 people appear, his body trembled and his face turned pale. He knew that the situation was hopeless. Chapter 93. Those 3 people were Hu Daishang's personal maid, a guard from the Hu Manor, and a secret guard from the 6th King's Manor. After a few simple interrogations, everything began to come to light, and the truth came to light. Actually, the truth was not complicated. Hu Daishang looked virtuous, but deep down she was a bit licentious. She relied on her status as the Grand Marshal's daughter to act willfully and recklessly. First, she seduced the Crown Prince Ji Yunhuang but was rejected. Then she changed her mind and accepted Ji Yunhao's love. However, she was still somewhat indignant, so she took advantage of Ji Yunhao's absence to hook up with a handsome guard from the Hu Manor. After a few secret encounters, she unexpectedly became pregnant. When Ji Yunhao returned, she purposely hooked him into bed several times, intending to blame the child on him. That day, when Ji Yunhao became suspicious at the tea house, he immediately investigated and found out the truth. He was extremely angry and wanted to kill. The guard from the Hu Manor who came in was the adulterer, and the secret guard from the 6th King's Manor was the one who went to assassinate him. As for Hu Daishang's personal maid, she was a witness and an insider of the entire matter. Originally, she was also on Ji Yunhao's list of people who wanted to kill her. Unexpectedly, the 2 of them did not die and now became living witnesses, Out of consideration for their own safety, the adulterer and the maidservant told him everything that had happened. As for the secret guard from the sixth king's manor, he did not dare to lie due to the majesty of the imperial family. In front of irrefutable evidence, Ji Yunhao could no longer deny it. He knelt down in front of Lu Hinti and admitted his guilt. He only said that he accidentally killed someone in anger, but in reality he had long regretted it. As for General Hu, he had no face left. No matter what, his own daughter having an affair was an extremely disgraceful matter. His face turned green and white, but he didn't dare to make any more demands. He could only wait for Luxian Emperor's verdict. In front of the fairy child, Lu Hinti could not be too biased, so he finally passed down the verdict. Although Ji Yunhao killed someone, it was Hu Daishang who had done it first. In a moment of anger, it was pardonable for him to act. In order to show fairness, Ji Yunhao was severely punished with 80 strokes of the cane. He was removed from the throne and demoted to a commoner. He was chased out of the imperial city, and was not allowed to take a single step into the capital for 3 years. Anyone who violated this rule would be killed without mercy. Ji Yunhao's face was ashen. He thanked the emperor for his benevolence and was about to leave to receive his punishment when the boy stepped forward. "Your Majesty, I still have something to say." Lu Hinti could only say, "Fairy child, please speak your mind." The boy said, "Ning Shuama has suffered such injustice. Is your Majesty only going to say that she was wronged and let it go?" Lu Hinti paused for a moment and then sighed. "It was me who let Miss Ning down. However, the dead cannot be brought back to life, and there is nothing I can do about it. I and her father are both monarch and minister, as well as friends. His daughter is like my own daughter. I'll make her." Just as he was about to act magnanimous and grant Ning Shuama the status of a princess, Ji Yunhuang, who was beside him, suddenly spoke, "Your Majesty, Shuama was originally your daughter-in-law. Granting her the title of a princess is inappropriate." Lu Hinti was stunned. He looked at the kneeling Ji Yunhao and said, "Why don't we let this evil creature make her his wife?" Before he could finish his sentence, he was interrupted by Ji Yunhuang. "That's also not appropriate. Sixth brother is already a commoner. Shuama should at least be a princess. This son is willing." He did not finish his sentence before the boy interrupted him with a smile. "Let me ask for a few rewards for her. What does your Majesty think?" In fact, Luxian Emperor had already guessed what Ji Yunhuang wanted to say. In his heart, he rejoiced that he had been interrupted by the child. Thus, he immediately said in a kind tone, "I will listen to a mortal child's words. What reward does a mortal child want to ask for?" "First, your Majesty, please pardon her for the crime of deceiving the monarch." Lu Hinti secretly rolled his eyes. That girl was already dead. How could she still deceive the monarch? Therefore he went with the flow and agreed. "I'll allow this. What else?" Chapter 94. The boy said, "Marquis Jingyuan's residence is a bit poor. Your Majesty, please bestow her with 10,000 taels of gold." This was a bit like a lion opening its mouth. In Chongkong country, 10,000 taels of gold was the lifetime salary of a first-rank official. Marquis Jingyuan's residence did not even have a master. What use would 10,000 taels of gold be to them? Lu Hinti felt a bit of heartache as he muttered, "This?" The boy looked at him. "Your Majesty is unwilling? Could it be that in your Majesty's heart, 10,000 taels of gold is more valuable than the position of princess?" Lu Hinti's face darkened. Because he had guessed the identity of the boy, he could not refute and could only grit his teeth and agree. The boy continued to raise 2 other conditions. The first was that the chastity testing beast would officially belong to Ning Shuama. The second was that he wanted to personally supervise the execution of the 6th prince when he was being flogged. Of these 2 conditions, Luxian Emperor happily agreed to the first. The second condition was somewhat forced, but he had no choice but to agree. The kneeling Ji Yunhao's complexion slightly changed. In fact, anyone who had worked in the imperial palace would know that the flogging was very particular. The same 80 strokes could directly kill a person, but it could also cause the person to only suffer a few superficial wounds. It looked frightening, but it was not a big deal. When a prince was being punished under normal circumstances, the executioner would grasp the heat. But if this boy was supervising the execution, Who would dare to go easy on him? Ji Yunhao was pressed down on the execution bench. Four executioners stood at his side with black and red flogs in their hands. The boy slowly walked over and looked down at Ji Yunhao, who was lying there in a sorry state. He seemed to smile. It was obviously an ordinary smile, but it made Ji Yunhao's hair stand on end. It was as if he saw the smile of a man-eating monster. That familiar feeling was even stronger. He knew that today's beating was unavoidable. He closed his eyes and secretly channeled the psychokinesis in his body to form a protective layer around his body. This protective layer could not be seen or touched, but it could block the beating of Ting's rod for him. At most, he would suffer some superficial wounds. The boy circled around him and smiled again. He stretched out his white little hand and gently knocked on a certain part of his back. The sixth prince has a very high psychokinesis, which is enough to defend himself. You don't have to worry when you hit him. If you dare to go easy on him, I'll make you take twice the punishment for him. He turned around and looked at Luhinti, who was sitting not far behind him. Your Majesty, isn't that right? Luhinti forced a smile. Fairy child, don't worry. They wouldn't dare. This threat was very practical. The four executioners shuddered and answered in unison, yes. Ji Yunhuang, who was standing beside Luhinti, had a strange look in his eyes as he looked at the boy with a complicated expression. Vengeful for the smallest grievance. This little fellow really wasn't a kind child. Ji Yunhao was complaining incessantly in his heart. That boy had unintentionally knocked on his chi acupoint just now, and it just so happened that it had knocked on his chi acupoint. It made him feel as if his acupoint was sealed, and his psychokinesis was suddenly broken. He could no longer operate his psychokinesis. Right now, he was no different from an ordinary person. When he was flogged, he was not allowed to use psychokinesis to resist. Therefore, Ji Yunhao could only suffer in silence. He could not even say a word. He knew that today's punishment was inevitable. The boy was still not at ease. He checked the four executioner sticks one by one. After confirming that there was nothing fishy, he returned them to them. Then, he sat on a chair and said with a smile, let's begin. Chapter 95. The black and red cudgel struck Ji Yunhao's body again and again with the sound of the wind. After 3 or 4 strikes, his body was already bleeding. Ji Yunhao did not want to lose face as a prince in front of everyone. At the beginning, he could still clench his teeth and endure the pain. But after a few strikes, he could not help but groan. After a dozen strikes, he began to groan. As the cudgel fell, his groans became louder and louder, as if he was about to cry out in pain. The cold sweat on his forehead kept rolling down his face. Not far away, Luhinti heard his ghost-like wails and wolf-like howls, but his face darkened. It was just a beating, how painful could it be? As a man and a prince, how could he not be able to endure this? How could he cry out like this? He had lost the face of the imperial family. When he was fighting on the battlefield, he was struck by a poisonous arrow. The medical facilities in the army were not sufficient, and the army doctor did not have anesthetics to help him remove the arrow. He scraped his bones to treat the poison, and blood flowed into a small basin. All the soldiers were frightened, but he did not make a sound. He was even able to casually chat with the doctor. Because of this, he was given the title of Iron Blood Prince, and received the respect and love of all the soldiers in the army. This was the foundation for his later seizure of power. He had a strong personality, and naturally did not want his children and grandchildren to be so spineless. He also looked down on cowards who cried out in pain. Originally, Ji Yunhao was very favored by Luhinti, but after this incident, he did not like him anymore. He treated his son coldly. Of course, this was a story for later. Ji Yunhao simply wanted to bite his tongue and commit suicide. It was not that he had never been injured in his life, and it was not that he had never eaten a beating, but it was never this kind of pain. It was as if salt had been sprinkled on the cudgel. Every strike was as painful as a bee sting, as if he was being dismembered. It was so painful that he could not help but cry out and struggle, but before he was tortured, his 4 limbs were fixed in place by special iron cuffs. He could not break free. His body twisted with all his might, with tears and snot running down his face, like a caterpillar struggling on its deathbed. When the surrounding people saw how miserable his cries were, they all knelt down and begged Lu Hinti for mercy. Even Ji Yunhuang pleaded with Lu Hinti, "Imperial father, sixth brother also knows his mistake. He has been spoiled since he was young. Why don't we reduce his punishment?" Lu Hinti's face was as gloomy as water. He also felt that his son was too spoiled and needed to be hardened. "Keep fighting. Not one strike less. Whoever begs for mercy again, I'll beat him up too." His words silenced everyone. Lu Hinti was still angry and ordered, "Shut his mouth. Don't let him cry like a ghost again." As a result, Ji Yunhao's mouth was also stuffed with a special gag. And he couldn't make another sound. Because the pain was too intense, although Ji Yunhao was in so much pain that he hovered between life and death, he was unable to faint even if he wanted to. When he whipped others, he was afraid that they would not feel enough pain. Now that he was the one being beaten, he wished that there would be no more pain in this world. He stared fixedly at the boy. He really did not understand how he had offended him to make him use such a method. Suddenly, Ning Xuema's figure flashed through his mind. His heart suddenly moved. This boy's figure was 80% similar to Ning Xuema's. He stared at the boy's small face. He knew that the boy was wearing a mask. He only stared fixedly at the boy's eyes. This boy had a pair of extremely bright eyes. They were as clear as water and as limpid as a lake. Chapter 96. This boy had a pair of extremely bright eyes, as clear as water, as limpid as a lake. At this moment, this pair of eyes was also looking at him, flickering with light as if they were smiling. Ji Yunhao's body suddenly stiffened. This pair of eyes unexpectedly also looked like the eyes of the girl in his impression. Could it be that this boy was actually Ning Xuema in disguise? But wasn't she already dead? It was impossible for her to appear here again. The boy's line of sight met his in the air, staring at each other for a moment. The boy's eyes slightly narrowed, curved like the crescent moon, as dark as the night. Ji Yunhao's eyes suddenly widened. This expression. He had seen it before in the tea house. At that time when he whipped Ning Xuema, and Ning Xuema was rescued by the Crown Prince Ji Yunhuang. She also had this expression. This expression. This boy is Ning Xuema. He wanted to shout out, but when he opened his mouth he found that there was something stuck in his mouth, and he could not make a sound. The boy tilted his head to look at his face. The happy expression in his eyes deepened. Demon. She's simply a little demon. The enmity between the two of them is set. Ji Yunhao's teeth itched with hatred, but he could not expose her identity. Ning Xuema happily looked at him. This bastard whipped her 3 times, making her feel so much pain that she wished she was dead. He even put the blame on her, almost taking her little life. If she did not take revenge, how could she face herself? Just now when she was inspecting the stick, she took the opportunity to add a little something to it. She had collected them from a jujube tree. On the tree there was a type of small insect that stung people. This insect had a type of poison on its body. Once it came into contact with the poison, it wouldn't take the person's life, but it would cause extreme pain, making the person wish that they had never been born in this world. She felt that the pain should be comparable to the effect of the soul-breaking whip, enough for her to take revenge. She looked at Ji Yunhao's pale face from the pain, her heart incomparably carefree. She had never been a good person. She did not understand what it meant to repay evil with good. She was particular about repaying kindness and enmity. If you respect me a foot, I'll return you 10 feet. If you bully me a foot, I'll bully you 10 feet. As long as someone bullied her, she would think of a way to make the other party pay back 10 times, 100 times. 80 strikes, not one less. Ji Yunhao had managed to survive. When he was helped down from the torture stool, he was already badly mutilated. There was not a single piece of flesh on his back that was intact. He could not even stand. When the servant removed the gag from his mouth, he immediately cried out, "She's Ning Xuema. Imperial father, she is Ning Xuema." He desperately raised a bloody hand and pointed at the boy. It was earth-shattering. Other than Ji Yunhuang, everyone present looked at the boy. Lu Hinti also slightly narrowed his eyes. He looked at the boy and then at Ji Yunhao. "What nonsense are you talking about? Isn't Ning Xuema dead?" "It's her. Imperial father. It was her." Sun recognizes her eyes. Ji Yunhao's tone was excited and certain. Lu Hinti could not help but look at Ji Yunhuang. Huang isn't this celestial child under the ancestor? Before Ji Yunhuang could say anything, the boy had already raised his hand and removed the mask on his face. He smiled and bowed to Lu Hinti. Shuema thanks your majesty for clearing Shuema's injustice and giving Shuema justice. Lu Hinti was speechless. Ji Yunhuang also took the opportunity to apologize. Imperial father, please forgive me. Sun had no other choice. Shuema insisted on proving her innocence, so Sun brought her into the palace in disguise. Chapter 97. Lu Hinti stared blankly for a moment. His mood was obviously not good. What exactly happened? She didn't die and escaped from prison? There was obviously a trap waiting for Ning Shuema to jump into. If she admitted that she escaped from prison, it would be another crime. Ning Shuema immediately replied, Your Majesty, I didn't escape from prison. I was released by someone. She had already thought of an excuse in her mind. This humble girl was wrongly accused and was sent to the Ministry of Justice's prison by official Lu without distinguishing between right and wrong. This humble girl was unable to cry out for justice in such a dark place. Fortunately, Tui Dao listened to this humble girl's grievances. He also respected my father for being a good official who served the country and the people. Thus, he boldly decided to let this humble girl out. This humble girl could actually take advantage of the night to escape, but this humble girl is still Marquis Ning's daughter. If this humble girl were to run away like this, it would smear my father's name and ruin his illustrious reputation. Shuema also thought that His Majesty should be kept in the dark about this matter. Once he knew the truth, he would definitely clear Shuema's name. Therefore, Shuema went to beg Crown Prince and asked him to bring Shuema into the palace to plead her grievances. Crown Prince was kind and righteous, so he immediately started to investigate this matter. Relying on his outstanding ability, he found clues to this case. Because he was afraid that Shuema's appearance would alarm His Majesty, he let Shuema follow him in disguise. Her words were 70% true and 30% false. There were no loopholes. Even Lu Hinti couldn't find any fault with her words. Lu Hinti paused for a moment and coldly said, From what I know, that Tui Dao wasn't so chivalrous. Ji Yunhuang stepped forward. Imperial Father, I've also investigated this matter. Tui Dao didn't release Miss Ning completely because of his chivalrous heart. Instead, it was because Miss Ning used her superb medical skills to treat his legs. That was why he took the risk to release her. The 4 prison guards under him and the guards guarding the prison can all testify. He explained everything in great detail, including how Tui Dao drowned because he was too happy and drunk. Finally, he added, Imperial Father, although Tui Dao's actions were wrong, by a freak combination of factors, he managed to save Miss Ning's life. He prevented her from dying a wrongful death and gave the imperial family a chance to remedy the situation. It should be Marquis Ning's spirit in heaven protecting Miss Yuning. The last sentence reminded Lu Hinti of the nightmare he had this morning. He coughed once, not wanting to let the matter drop. Ning Shuema being released is one thing, but why did she disguise herself as the ancestor's fairy child? Because of this, he didn't dare to show favoritism and had to beat up his son. Ning Shuema widened her eyes and said innocently, This humble girl has never said that I am the ancestor's fairy child. So your majesty has misunderstood my identity? Lu Hinti choked. After thinking about it carefully, he realized that Ning Shuema had never said such a thing. Everything was just a misunderstanding he had speculated. It was all this girl's fault for behaving so strangely just now. She knew too many strange things, and the ancestor's servant also had this characteristic. Furthermore, she was coincidentally brought in by Ji Yunhuang, so he had this kind of misunderstanding. Damn it. Actually, they did it on purpose. Luxian Emperor could not help but glare at Ji Yunhuang. He was still not reconciled. Ning Shuema, I have helped you clear your name. However, you did not reveal your true face to others. In the end, you have committed the crime of deceiving the monarch. Ning Shuema blinked again. Didn't your majesty pardon Shuema in advance for deceiving the emperor? Chapter 98. So she had been waiting for him all along. This little girl was really careful at every step. Her actions were watertight, and even he had unknowingly fallen into her trap. This time Luhinti was truly at a loss for words. He couldn't help but size up Ning Xuema. The little girl was kneeling there, her head slightly tilted as she looked at him. Her eyes were clear, and she looked innocent. Her attitude was neither servile nor overbearing. Luhinti's intuition told him that this little girl wasn't simple. Marquis Jingyuan was hot-blooded and loyal, and he did things openly and aboveboard. Even his wife was only a gentle and virtuous daughter of a humble family. She only knew how to take care of her husband and children, and she didn't have any schemes. Who would have thought that she would give birth to such a clever and eccentric daughter at first glance? This girl was like a puddle of clear water. But at second glance she was like an extremely deep pool. The pool looked clear and shallow, but in reality it was unfathomable. This kind of girl was a combination of contradictions, and she was also like a small light source. Unknowingly, she attracted everyone's attention. He couldn't help but look at Ji Yunhao. Was this brat blind? He didn't want such a good girl, and instead chose to like that brainless Hu Daichang. He said in a low voice, "You were actually able to cure Tui Dao's leg? Your medical skills can be considered very high. You also know a lot of strange things. I wonder who your teacher is?" Ning Xuema smoothly replied, "No one taught me. It was a gift from the heavens." A gift from the heavens? Luhinti clearly didn't believe her. What kind of gift from the heavens? Ning Xuema casually replied, "It's probably because the heavens pitied Xuema for being alone, so they sent an immortal to teach Xuema medical skills in her dreams, so that Xuema could have a skill to rely on." What did the immortal look like in your dreams? This emperor's inquiries were really detailed. Ning Xuema secretly rolled her eyes. She could only casually make up a story. The immortal in the dream probably used some kind of camouflage technique. Xuema couldn't see his true appearance. I only vaguely remembered that he seemed to be wearing an ice-cold mask and was dressed in white. His aura was extremely strong, like a snow sculpture. Luhinti's expression changed slightly, and he suddenly stood up. "Di Zun." Huh. Ning Xuema's eyes widened. It can't be, right? She had only made up a few words, and he had already connected her with the Overlord? It couldn't be so coincidental, right? Ever since she came to this continent, she had heard of the ancestor's reputation like thunder. She knew that he was the most popular person on this continent and was worshipped by mortals like an immortal. Unfortunately, even though she was saved by him once, she still didn't know whether he was round or flat. It seemed that not many people on this continent knew his true identity. He was extremely mysterious. Ning Xuema had seen countless experts' demeanors in her previous life. They were also extremely cold and noble. They had an appearance that didn't talk to mortals, and when they spoke they were like clouds and mist, full of zen. They had the highest level of being able to make people unable to understand them, and they were very pretentious. They were also widely worshipped by the masses, and many high officials and nobles fought to give them tickets to become their disciples. Outside they were also very mysterious, and some people even worshipped them as saviors. However, after Ning Xuema deliberately made friends with them a few times, she was always able to easily see through their disguises and beat them back to their original selves. Using Ning Xuema's summary, the so-called Great Master was a deceitful person who liked to bring you along to act pretentious and soar. He didn't have much ability, but he had a lot of ability to bluff people. He was a complete swindler. You said that he was wearing white clothes? That white clothes looked like they were woven from clouds and mist? Was the mask on his face different every time? But they all had the same kind of aura. Chapter 99. You said he was wearing a white robe? That white robe looked like it was woven from clouds? Is the mask on his face different every time? But they all have the same aura. Luhinti asked a series of questions. Ning Xuema answered vaguely. This seems to be the case. But I can't remember. Because every time I wake up, I can't remember the immortal's appearance. I only remember the medical skills he taught me. Her answer was very slippery, neither admitting nor denying, making everyone unable to distinguish the truth from the lies. Is it the legendary dream entering technique? Luhinti slowly sat down, becoming more and more bewildered. Rumor has it that the emperor's selection of disciples is extremely strict. and the conditions are unimaginably harsh. He didn't accept anyone who wasn't a peerless genius, a disciple of the imperial family, an ugly person, a talkative person, and even a dark-skinned person. All in all, there were very few people in the entire continent who could catch his eye. It had been several decades since he had accepted a new disciple. Why would he inexplicably use the most profound dream-entering technique to teach Ningshuama? This is illogical. More importantly, didn't the ancestor no longer accept female disciples? Why did he break his vow this time? But if the immortal in Ningshuama's dream was not him, then who else could it be? As far as he knows, in the entire Tianxi continent, only the emperor can use the dream-entering technique. It is impossible for there to be a second person. And according to Ningshuama's description of the immortal's appearance is roughly consistent with the emperor's. What qualities does this little girl have that made the emperor so fond of her? He couldn't help but look at Ningshuama several times. Could it be that this little girl is actually a genius? Is there something wrong with the crystal? No, he had to test her aptitude with his own eyes. If she really is a peerless genius, then he will throw caution to the wind and not care about the reputation of the royal family, and let his proudest son take her as his concubine. He suddenly stood up and said to Ningshuama with an amiable expression, "Shuama, come with me." Ningshuama naturally didn't know what Lihin Ti was thinking. She had no choice but to follow him. Ji Yunhuang's eyes flashed and he moved to her side. He held her hand and said, "Don't be afraid, I'm here. Imperial Father won't do anything to you." His palm was warm, causing Ningshuama's heart to feel slightly warm. This time, she was able to turn over a new leaf because of the Crown Prince's help. She clearly distinguished between gratitude and grudges. Towards the Crown Prince, she was very grateful. She was the boss of the Secret Service in her previous life, and her subordinates all listened to her. At that time, she led them through who knows how many life and death situations. In the most dangerous times, she often said, "I'm here for everything." Always giving everyone strength. They really trusted her wholeheartedly, and she really used all kinds of methods to win by surprise and lead them out of their predicament. What she often did was to shelter others from the wind and rain, and now there was someone who stepped forward to shelter her from the wind and rain. It turns out that the feeling of being sincerely cared for is also very good. Ningshuama never had the habit of holding hands with others. She lifted her hand and brushed her hair, taking the opportunity to withdraw her hand. She smiled and said, "Yunhuang, thank you." Ji Yunhuang's heart jumped. After knowing each other for so many days, this was the first time she called him by his name. Originally, other than his imperial father and brother, he would feel offended if other people directly called him by his name. But today, when this little girl called him by his name, his heart felt warm. Chapter 100. He also smiled. "Shuama, there's no need to be polite between us." The two of them followed Lihin Ti side by side. Since the emperor had left, the officials naturally dispersed. Ji Yunhao, who had just been punished, was left alone. No one cared about him anymore. Ji Yunhao could no longer walk. He was supported by a guard to lie down on a bench. He stared blankly at his brother and Ningshuama as they walked away. He clenched his fists. She should have been his wife or even his concubine. But now, she was gradually drifting away from him, and it was impossible for her to return to his side. Unwillingness, anger, resentment. All kinds of complicated emotions coiled around his chest. He was really blind. He mistakenly threw away the luminous pearl as trash, but he took a fisheye as a treasure and brought it home. He regretted it so much that his intestines turned green. If he could start over again, he definitely would not choose to force her to break off the engagement. Instead, he would imprison her by his side, allowing her to blossom only for him. Could it be that he had to let her go now? No, he was not willing to. Ji Yunhao's face flashed with a trace of ruthlessness. He knew that his imperial father demoted him to a commoner to give an explanation to General Hu and Ningshuama. Even a vicious tiger would not eat its cubs. Soon, his imperial father would definitely find a reason to restore his status as a prince. Wasn't his imperial residence not taken back? His trusted aides were still there. He would make a comeback. In the solemn and serene main hall, black and white were its main colors. There were very few furnishings in the main hall. There was only a crystal platform, and on top of the crystal platform, there were 5 different colored crystal pillars. Next to each crystal pillar, there was an old man wearing a different colored robe. Seeing Lu Hinti enter, the 5 of them cupped their hands in greeting. Your Majesty! They were the guardians of the psychokinesis crystal pillars, and were not bound by the secular world. They only respected the strong, so they were more polite to Ji Yunhuang than to Lu Hinti. They bowed. Your Highness the Crown Prince. Ning Shuima finally understood why Lu Hinti brought her here. It seemed like the emperor was suspicious of her aptitude and wanted to re-examine it. She raised her eyes to look at the 5 crystal pillars, and then looked at the 5 envoys who were constantly sizing her up with gazes as sharp as knives. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of expression the 5 envoys would have if she was still found to have a trash aptitude. What kind of expression would the emperor have? She sighed inwardly. Actually, she really didn't want to be a good-for-nothing, but this small body might not be able to live up to her expectations. 5 elders, please test this little girl's aptitude. Lu Hinti instructed. The 5 elders looked at Ning Shuima suspiciously. In the vast Sky Empire, the aptitude test was carried out before the age of 3, and the young lady in front of him was obviously over the age limit. Besides, they were here to test the aptitude of the children of the royal family, and there was only one princess. They had never heard of a second one. Could it be that this was also a dragon seed left behind by the emperor when he was young? Is she also His Majesty's princess? One of the men in red asked. Lu Hinti was speechless. She made it sound like he was a playboy. He was very picky when it came to this. It was not easy for a dragon seed to be left outside, and Ji Yunyao was an exception. 5 elders. She is the daughter of Marquis Jing Yuan, General Ning's daughter, Ning Shuima. She is not a princess. Ji Yunhuang promptly explained. Marquis Jing Yuan's daughter? That big trash? The elder in green was obviously disdainful. Damn. It seemed like her reputation as a trash was not small. She had reached a certain level of being a trash. Chapter 101. Deep down, Ning Shuima was an unperturbed child. Their level of offensive language was nothing to her. She treated it as a kind of gas. She smiled and took a step forward. It's rare that Shuima's reputation has reached the ears of the elders who guard the crystal pillars every day. Shuima is very honored. Perhaps one's physique is innate, but it doesn't mean one has no ability. Everyone who works hard should be respected. Since the 5 elders are able to serve the imperial family, I presume that your cultivation and temperament are top-notch. You won't be as shallow as those ordinary people. Don't you think so? The 5 elders were speechless. Ning Shuima was clearly praising them, but they could not refute her. She stood there with a smile. Her eyes were like pearls sparkling with light. Her thin lips were slightly pursed, as if she was smiling but not smiling. At such a young age she had a kind of temperament. Standing in front of her, the 5 elders actually felt ashamed of their inferiority. Her words also made their hearts move. Physique was indeed innate. Did people who were born trash deserve to be despised by everyone? Couldn't they live openly? Then what was the difference between them and the ordinary people? The 5 elders usually thought highly of themselves and thought that they were extraordinary. Now that they heard Ning Shuima's words, they were angry at first, but after thinking about it carefully, they felt a little ashamed. They could not help but look at Ning Shuima again. No matter if this girl was trash in psychokinesis or not, she was not simple. Just based on her temperament, she could throw the so-called psychokinesis geniuses several streets away. Miss Ning, please. The black-clothed elder gestured, his tone no longer showing any disdain. Thank you. Ning Shuima smiled and slowly walked forward. The test of aptitude followed the order of water, metal, earth, fire, wood. Ning Shuima followed their instructions and tested them one by one. Just as she expected, a miracle did not happen because of her transmigrator. The first 4 crystal pillars did not have any reaction at all. They did not light up at all. There were actually many useless people on this continent, but even the most ordinary person would have some sort of reaction if they pressed their palms on the crystal pillar. The more ordinary a person was, the more varied their telekinesis aptitude was. Some people could even make the 5 pillars light up faintly. It was also their first time seeing someone like Ning Shuima. Although it was within her expectations, Ning Shuama's heart still felt a bit uncomfortable. It seemed like her psychokinesis was really trash. It wasn't like those stories about strong women who transmigrated to another world where the testing equipment malfunctioned. Although she was a little disappointed, Ning Shuama didn't take it to heart because she was already mentally prepared. On the other hand, Ji Yunhuang could not bear to see her like this. Seeing that she was walking towards the green crystal pillar again, he reached out to stop her. Shuama, there's no need for the test. Ning Shuama's big eyes curved. It's okay. When you do something, you have to do it to the end. You can't give up halfway. She pushed his hand away and strode towards the pillar. Ji Yunhuang's expression changed slightly as he looked at her back. Not everyone had the courage to face failure head-on like this. If it was an ordinary girl, she would have stopped while she was ahead. She would have left some hope for others, and for herself, she would not be like her. Regardless of whether it was good or bad, she would ask for a clear result. The 5 elders' eyes also revealed a look of admiration. This little girl had courage. Chapter 102. When Ning Shuama placed her palm on the green crystal pillar, the green crystal pillar did not have any reaction. Just as everyone had expected, Ning Shuama smiled bitterly in her heart. She removed her hand from the crystal pillar and shrugged her shoulders. She walked down. Just as she stepped down from the platform, the green crystal pillar that had been dim all this while suddenly glowed faintly. Everyone looked at the crystal pillar, but the light disappeared in a flash and the pillar returned to its original appearance. Ji Yunhuang, on the other hand, was somewhat excited. He took a step forward and said, try again carefully. Maybe you have a wood element psychokinesis aptitude. Ning Shuama's heart was filled with hope. She placed her right hand on the pillar again. At first, the crystal pillar didn't have any reaction, but after a while, a faint green light shone from the bottom of the crystal pillar and climbed up little by little. When it reached the height of an inch, it stopped moving. It shook slightly and extinguished like a flame. Everyone was speechless. The crystal pillar was 1 meter high. The higher the psychokinesis, the higher the part of the pillar that lit up. 3 inches represented the first level of psychokinesis. An ordinary person would usually light up between 3 and 6 inches. Those who were slightly better could light up to 12 inches, which was the 3rd level. They could be considered to have better aptitudes. Ji Yunhuang's pillar was 20 inches high, which was already considered a genius. Ning Shuama pressed on the pillar for a long time, but it only lit up a little. It was not even enough to light up the 1st level. Lu Hinti looked at Ning Shuama with disappointment. She was still a trash after all. She was not worthy of his most outstanding son. Ji Yunhuang coughed lightly and smiled. Congratulations, Shuama. It seems that the crystal pillar was wrong. You still have wood element psychokinesis. Ning Shuama had stayed here for a while and knew that her aptitude was not good enough. She was only slightly better than a super trash, however, she was not discouraged. After all, she still had some potential, right? As long as she made good use of it, there was still room for improvement. Moreover, she could still cultivate her inner energy. This body was a good seedling for cultivating inner force. She clapped her hands and smiled nonchalantly in response to Ji Yunhuang's congratulations. Many thanks. She then jumped down from the stage and asked Lu Hinti to leave. Your Majesty, there shouldn't be anything for this humble girl to do, right? Can this humble girl return home now? She had already been out for 2 days and 1 night. Right now, Marquis Jingyuan's mansion was in a complete mess. I don't know if that International Friends chastity testing beast is roaring because it can't communicate with people. Before Lu Hinti could say anything, Ji Yunhuang also jumped down and landed beside Ning Shuama. Shuama, this prince will send you back. Lu Hinti calmly looked at his son and then looked at Ning Shuama. His brows slightly furrowed. His son seemed to be very concerned about this little girl. This was not a good sign. He had to think of another way to completely dispel his son's ideas that he shouldn't have. His son was so outstanding. Naturally, he needed the most outstanding and perfect girl to match him. Ning Shuama was obviously not good enough. What method should he use? After all, she was Marquis Jingyuan's daughter. He couldn't be too ruthless. Just as he was thinking of a way to satisfy both sides, the inner palace chief steward, who had always been calm outside, suddenly rushed in. He ran too quickly and almost tripped on the doorstep. Before he could steady himself, He used an excited voice to report to Lu Hinti, "Your Majesty Di Zun. Di Zun has come to visit." Chapter 103. Before he could even steady himself, he used an excited voice to report to Lu Hinti, "Your Majesty, the ancestor. The ancestor has come to visit." Everyone was shocked. Lu Hinti suddenly turned around and walked out in large strides, passed down the order. "Clean the streets with fresh flowers. Let everyone welcome the ancestor." He hurriedly took 2 steps out and turned around to instruct Ji Yunhuang and Ning Xuema, "You two also come with me to welcome him." Ning Xuema was speechless. Ji Yunhuang aside, why did the emperor call her? Shouldn't only those with official positions have the qualifications to welcome him? Why did he call a commoner girl like her? She really wanted to go back to her own residence to rest. She didn't want to welcome that old swindler, however. Since the emperor had given this order, her small arms could not twist the emperor's thighs. She could only follow unwillingly. The efficiency of the imperial palace was not to be underestimated. Although the ancestor's arrival was sudden, the people in the imperial palace were still orderly. In just a moment, they had already formed 2 rows in front of and behind the emperor and hurriedly walked towards the palace gate. Ning Xuema walked side by side with Ji Yunhuang. She quietly asked, "It seems like the ancestor doesn't come often." "Of course. The last time he came was 18 years ago." "That's not right. Didn't he appear once a few days ago?" "That time, he even conveniently gave her justice. That time he was just passing by. He only appeared for a quarter of an hour before leaving. So, his appearance was just for show." Ning Xuema was extremely speechless. "That's right, you said that the hot spring in your residence was created by the ancestor. Could it be that it was 18 years ago?" Yunhuang nodded. "That's right. At that time I was only 5 years old. Imperial father had just built the crown prince residence for me. I didn't even have time to live there before I was fortunate enough to become the place where the ancestor was received. Furthermore, the ancestor only stayed there for 2 days before leaving. Imperial father only paid him a visit once. This Di Zun really knows how to show off to the highest level. He should have some skills, right?" Ning Xuema unkindly ridiculed him in her heart. "How old is the ancestor?" Since she was bored and couldn't leave, she decided to gossip. Ji Yunhuang shook his head. "I'm not sure either. Aren't you his grand disciple? How could he not even know master's age? Isn't this grand disciple of yours too unqualified?" Ji Yunhuang lightly sighed. "Don't talk about me. I'm afraid that even my master doesn't know. The ancestor accepts a new disciple every 80 years or so. Currently, the ancestor has a total of 18 disciples under his tutelage, and my master is the youngest. My master is already 60 years old this year." Ning Xuema was speechless. According to this calculation, it had been 1,500 years since the ancestor had accepted a disciple. This was not even counting the number of years he had spent before he accepted a disciple. The lifespan of the people in this era was no different from that of her original era. An ordinary person could live up to 80 years old. Only those who had reached the first rank of the earth level could slow down their aging. The higher their cultivation, the longer their lifespan. When one reached the 8th level of the earth level, they could break through the limits of life and live for 1,000 years. However, they wouldn't be immortal and would die after a certain age. For example, the first few disciples that the ancestor had accepted were no longer in this world. According to legend, only when one's psychokinesis broke through the 2nd rank of the heaven level could one truly break through the barrier of life and death and become immortal. Could it be that the ancestor had really become a deity? He was close to 2,000 years old and could be compared to the god of longevity. Chapter 104. He was close to 2,000 years old and could be compared to the god of longevity. She wondered if his face was also as red as the god of longevity. Ning Xuema began to imagine the ancestor's appearance in her mind. The palace gates opened wide. Ning Xuema followed the welcoming team out of the palace gates and finally saw the ancestor's carriage. It was still the same sedan chair that was as bright as the day, the same young girls wrapped around the sedan chair with fine muslin, the same delicate and pretty boy leading the way, and behind the sedan chair were still the same tall and straight youths who could run for model. Apart from the ancestor's carriage, everyone else who passed by knelt on the ground, not daring to breathe loudly. Lu Hinti waved his hand and the civil and military officials behind him all knelt down. Ning Xuema naturally could not stand there and also knelt down. Lu Hinti bowed in greeting. "Welcome, ancestor." "Don't." A word finally came out from the sedan chair. A word that was as precious as gold. Ning Xuema's heart skipped a beat. She finally heard the ancestor speak. His voice did not sound old or young, like the wind at the top of a mountain, faintly blowing past everyone's ears. Lu Hinti said a bunch of polite words about the ancestor's presence. Although he did not bow down to the ancestor, his respectful appearance was like a greeting to the heavens. Ning Xuema knelt there until her knees hurt. She could not help but curse in her heart. This emperor was even more long-winded than some leaders who made reports, but his ability to improvise was really good. He wasn't like some leaders who read from a script. She heard that the ancestor liked to be quiet and did not like people to be long-winded. Why was he so calm this time? Was it a way to show off? She could not help but quietly look up at the sedan chair. The emperor had spoken for so long, why don't you say something again? But the group of people stood there quietly, not even coughing. There was no sound from the sedan chair, not even half a word. Even though Lu Hinti was talking to himself, the venerable emperor had no intention of getting off the palanquin. Lu Hinti said a lot of things, but he still didn't get any response from the other side. He felt a little embarrassed. Suddenly, a boy stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, the Venerable D said that he will only rest here for 3 days. He only needs a really clean courtyard. Your Majesty doesn't need to be busy with other things." Lu Hinti's face reddened. The ancestor's arrival was too sudden, and the palace's preparations were not complete. He had deliberately said so much in front of the palace gate, but it was only to delay a little bit so that the palace servants could prepare properly. Who would have thought that the other party would be able to see through it with a single glance? He could only bow again and didn't dare to be long-winded. "Ancestor, please." The ancestor's carriage finally entered. Ning Xuema finally saw the venerable sovereign's extravagance with her own eyes. The boy in front casually threw down a snow-white carpet, as if he had laid a layer of white clouds on the road. After the venerable emperor's carriage passed, the boy in the back put away the carpet. The whole group of people walked lightly, as if they were floating on the clouds. It was magnificent, as if the sun god was patrolling the sky. Ning Xuema sighed in her heart. Compared to the venerable emperor, the old monster of Xingqiu, who made his disciples shout civil and martial virtues, unifying Jianghu every time he went out, was really weak. This was the highest level of pretentiousness. Zhangyang was low-key and noble. He was worthy of being a monarch who had lived for nearly 2,000 years. This aura was simply natural. It was impossible not to be convinced. Chapter 105. The palace was the place where the emperor lived. The eunuchs and palace maids were all cautious and conscientious. No matter which hall it was, they were all clean and spotless. There were very few places that were unclean. However, Lu Hinti understood that the cleanliness that the ancestor wanted was not the usual kind of cleanliness, but the kind of cleanliness that no one had ever lived in. Fortunately, there were many halls in the palace, so it was not difficult to find one. Chongwen Palace was the best place to go. With Lu Hinti personally leading the way, the ancestor's sedan chair finally stopped at the entrance of Chongwen Palace. Ning Xuema unconsciously held her breath. She could finally see the ancestor's true appearance. He could not possibly let people carry the sedan chair into the main hall, right? Whoosh whoosh whoosh. The figures of the young men and women beside the sedan chair flashed. Like a blooming flower surrounding the sedan chair, Ning Xuema's lips twitched. These people were holding a piece of gauze made of unknown material in their hands, which densely covered the sedan chair. The gauze was thin and transparent, reflecting the sunlight, flashing with a rainbow light. And in this rainbow light, one could faintly see a person coming down from the sedan chair. Because of the veil, Ning Xuema was unable to clearly see the person's appearance. She could only vaguely make out a person's silhouette. It was as if a floating immortal was draped in multicolored light as it walked into the main hall. When the gauze was removed, the figure in front of the main hall could no longer be seen. Even the sedan chair was nowhere to be found. The young men stood in a fan shape at the entrance. Ning Xuema. "No way. After being busy for so long, she could only see a vague figure? What a loss. No wonder Ji Yunhuang, as his grand disciple, had only seen him twice. This ancestor was too difficult to meet. His every move was being closely guarded by the guards. Could it be that he had to be surrounded even when he went to the toilet? She looked at Lu Hinti, who was also blocked outside, then looked at Ji Yunhuang. She could not help but yawn and whispered, "Your Highness, the ancestor has already come in. There's nothing else for me to do, right? Can I leave now?" Although the ancestor was mysterious, Ning Shuama did not have any interest in finding out. She felt that rather than looking at the birthday boy who covered his face, it was better to go back and look at Tom's bitter face. As soon as she finished speaking, the main hall's door opened, and a boy walked out slowly. He said in a clear voice, "The ancestor invites your majesty to have an audience after you have bathed. Your majesty can bring 2 people in. The rest can leave. The ancestor likes peace." Ning Shuama's heart was filled with joy. The emperor could only bring 2 people with him, so he definitely wouldn't choose her to accompany him. She could finally go home and sleep. Just as she was about to cheerfully bid farewell to Ji Yunhuang, Emperor Luxian spoke. "Yunhuang Shuama, quickly go bathe and change your clothes. Accompany me to meet the emperor." Ning Shuama? Why did the ancestor brought her? She was just a commoner with no background and no one to rely on, okay? Her heart suddenly moved. Could it be that the old ancestor was fooled by her nonsense about heaven's gift, and thought that the ancestor was the one who came into her dream to teach her medical skills? Was that why he wanted to bring her in to verify it? Could he not be so melodramatic? She could run into the biggest boss just by talking nonsense. She did not have any objections to Lu Hinti treating her as the ancestor's disciple. After all, she could make the ancestor think twice before doing anything to her. But if she went in and exposed this lie, she did not know what the ancestor would do to her. She was just about to find a reason to refuse when a voice suddenly sounded from behind her. "Father, I can accompany you in with Brother Crown Prince." Chapter 106. Ning Shuama turned her head and saw a young girl fluttering in from behind. Her palace dress fluttered in the wind, and her appearance was cool and elegant. It was Princess Ji Yunyao, the one who harbored special feelings for her elder brother. In front of her imperial father and her elder brother, she was much gentler and no longer had her previous arrogance. She first greeted Lu Hinti and Ji Yunhuang, then quietly pushed aside Ning Shuama and stood side by side with Ji Yunhuang. She intimately held his arm and said, "Brother Crown Prince, let Yunyao go in with you, okay?" Ji Yunhuang, who had always been indifferent to others, saw this little sister and his brows relaxed a lot. He patted her hand and said, "Aren't you cultivating in the courtyard? Why did you come out?" Ji Yunyao pouted and said, "I just happened to come back to the palace. Since the ancestor wants 2 people to accompany imperial father, naturally they must be people of similar status. Can't be just any random person. Yunyao is the most suitable candidate. Imperial father, don't you think so?" After she finished speaking, she glanced at Ning Shuama. Ning Shuama almost wanted to yawn. The ancestor wanted Lu Hinti to bring 2 people in, but it was only for them to kneel and listen to his orders. What else could it be? She didn't want to do the job of waiting on others. Although this princess's words were a bit arrogant, it was exactly what she wanted. Therefore, Ning Shuama also took the opportunity to say, "Princess is right. If Princess and His Highness the Crown Prince accompany His Majesty, then it will truly complement each other. This humble girl still has matters to attend to, so I won't disturb you any longer. This humble girl will take her leave." Ji Yunhuang slightly frowned and glanced at Ning Shuama. Seeing her smiling face, his intuition told him that this little fox actually wanted to slip away. Lu Hinti straightforwardly said, "Yunyao, don't cause trouble. Shuama, you and Yunhuang will accompany me in. Quickly go bathe and change your clothes. Yunyao, go back and cultivate first. Don't cause trouble here. This is an imperial edict, go quickly." Once the emperor's imperial edict was issued, even Ji Yunyao didn't dare to disobey. She bit her lip and unwillingly replied with a yes. She then coldly glanced at Ning Shuama before turning to leave. Ning Shuama almost rubbed her forehead. The old emperor was afraid that her life would be too carefree, So he made another enemy for her. A jealous princess was the most annoying, especially when it was the princess who harbored feelings for her elder brother and tried her best to get rid of her dissidents by any means necessary. That was even more detestable. There is a beauty in the north who stands aloof from the world. A single glance could topple a city, and a second glance could topple a country. Her clothes were reflected in the clouds, and her face was reflected in the flowers. She suspected that they had met under the moon in the Jade Pavilion. The moment Ning Shuama finally saw the Dizun, all the poems that she had learned to describe beauties flashed through her mind. She felt that these poems were actually quite appropriate to describe the ancestor who was sitting at the head of the table. However, he had to change a few words. For example, changing it to the first seat has a beauty standing aloof from the world. The first ice chills the heart. The second ice chills the entire seat. The clouds think of clothes made of ice, resembling a glacier meeting under the moon. A living ice sculpture. A beautiful living ice sculpture. A living ice sculpture that was snow-white, with only black hair and eyes. He was wearing a snow-white robe of unknown material, which was unbelievably large. On the robe there were dark patterns in the shape of clouds moving. Along with the owner's occasional movements, those clouds seemed to float and move. On his head was a cloud-shaped white jade crown. The jade crown looked like mutton fat jade, but its luster was much warmer than mutton fat jade. It was translucent, and there seemed to be wind and clouds flowing inside. His long hair was like a curtain that flowed like water behind him, dragging directly on the ground with the white robe. Chapter 107. Move. His long hair was like a curtain of water flowing behind him, dragging directly on the ground with his white robe. White and black were intertwined, but the contrast was even more striking and soul-stirring. Sure enough, he was wearing a mask, an ice mask that covered his entire face. Not a single inch of his skin could be seen, only a pair of eyes behind the mask. To be exact, only his extremely black eyes could be seen, and even the shape of his eyes could not be seen. He just sat there like that. His entire body seemed to be shrouded in ice and snow, making it impossible to tell his age, ugliness, or beauty. If not for his tall and straight figure, Ning Shuama would not have been able to tell whether he was a man or a woman. Ning Shuama had never seen such a cold person in her life. Just one glance was enough to make people feel as if the coldness had seeped into their bones. It was clearly midsummer, so the room should be very hot. But this ancestor was just sitting there, emitting a faint aura, making the entire palace seem like an ice cave. The only thing missing was the cold wind whistling above their heads. This ancestor couldn't be a 1,000-year-old snow monster, right? How could he be so cold? Ning Shuama could not help but wrap her clothes tighter around her body. Then she looked at the people serving the ancestor, and her heart skipped a beat. The people beside the ancestor were all children with delicate features. Each of them looked like a red boy from a painting, making them extremely lovable. Among them was the child who had acted as a judge for her. He stood beside the ancestor, quietly waiting on him, slightly pursing his small lips without speaking or moving. These children were clearly very lovable, but each of their small faces was as cold and solemn as the ancestor. As for the accompanying young girls, each one of them stood far away, not moving forward. They were clearly at a lively age, but they were standing there like old pedants acting like statues. What a waste! What a waste! Ning Shuama secretly shook her head and frowned. Suddenly, she felt someone's gaze sweep over her. She subconsciously raised her head and met the eyes of the familiar child. Ning Shuama thought of his benevolence and slightly nodded her head at him, the corner of her lips curling up. The boy's eyes were like black crystals. His gaze was calm as he stared at Ning Shuama for a moment. Then, he looked away and continued to stand there with his eyes lowered. Ning Shuama didn't care. She sighed again. That time at the square, although this child was also cold and aloof, at least he was still somewhat popular. But now, standing next to the ancestor, there wasn't even the slightest trace of vitality. It seemed that the ice sculpture syndrome was contagious. The coldness also made Luhin Ti uncomfortable. He secretly activated the telekinesis in his body to protect himself. Only then was he able to speak as if nothing had happened. Naturally, he uttered another round of eloquent phrases. The venerable sovereign just sat there with his eyes slightly lowered. No one knew if he had heard him or not. From Ning Xuema's angle, she could only see his thick and long eyelashes. Lu Hinti's enthusiastic welcome speech didn't receive a single word from him. This venerable sovereign hadn't come for decades. Now, he suddenly came to the palace with great fanfare. There had to be some official business, right? But now he didn't say a single word. He was acting like an ice sculpture, not eating, drinking, or receiving. Could it be that he was just here to act cool and make his presence known? Ning Xuema was suspicious. She glanced at Lu Hinti again. She was a little surprised. Lu Hinti's face was green and his lips were white. Although he was still standing there, his clothes were trembling slightly. There was even a faint layer of frost on his forehead. It was obvious that he was extremely cold. Chapter 108. Ning Xuema also felt cold, but it was still within a tolerable range. She did not need to circulate her energy to resist the cold. She looked at Ji Yunhuang again. Ji Yunhuang's face was also slightly pale, but his complexion was much better than Lu Hinti's. His body was also not trembling. He looked normal. The main hall was silent for a while. Even a pin drop could be heard. This silence made Lu Hinti uncomfortable. As the host, how could he allow an awkward silence? However, he had already finished reading the poem that Hanlin Academy's great scholar had specially written for him. He had even memorized the original manuscript. If he wanted to continue, he would have to improvise. However, he did not understand this ancestor very well. He could not think of any common topics to talk about. Talk, only when the other party responded could it be called a conversation. Although there were many people in the main hall, there was not a single person who could respond. Lu Hinti was completely talking to himself. He was somewhat embarrassed and wanted to think of something to say. You may leave. The ancestor finally opened his mouth. Lu Hinti felt as if he had been pardoned. My mother. He could finally be free. He bowed again and said, yes, this little Huang will leave now. Ancestor, this little Huang specially brought the two of them. If the ancestor needs anything, just instruct them. He pointed at Ning Xuema and Ji Yunhuang who were standing behind him. Damn! She knew that they were here to be maids. At this time she could not say no. Therefore, Ning Xuema could only stand side by side with Ji Yunhuang and salute. We pay our respects to the ancestor. The ancestor did not say anything. He only raised his hand slightly, indicating that they were dismissed. Ning Xuema took the opportunity to stand up. She could feel a pair of ice-cold eyes on her body. It was strange. That time in the plaza, she and the ancestor were not only separated by a crown, but also by the bodies of countless people within a few dozen meters. But that time she clearly felt a pair of ice-cold eyes sweep over her. That one glance made her shiver in the hot weather. That feeling was so distinct that it was still fresh in her memory. Now this ancestor was sizing her up again. Although his gaze was cold, it was strangely different from before. It was as if they were not the same person, perhaps the first time. The ancestor deliberately wanted to give her a show of strength, so he faintly released his aura to frighten her and punish her for her offense. But this time he was just sizing her up, so his aura was weaker. The mask on the ancestor's face was too tight, so she couldn't see his expression. However, seeing how calm he was, perhaps he had already forgotten who she was. Lu Hinti was also secretly observing Di Zun's reaction when he saw Ning Xuema. If he really was the master in her dreams, he would definitely have a trace of surprise or some other expression on his face when they met. However, he was soon disappointed. This venerable sovereign was born with facial paralysis and wore a mask, so he couldn't see anything. He did not give up and simply said, "My son Yunhuang is your grand-disciple. There is no need for me to introduce her. Although this girl looks ordinary, she has received a gift from the heavens and has some special skills." The ancestor finally raised his eyes. Although he was still calm, there was some emotion in his tone. Gift from the heavens? Special skills? That's right. This girl received a gift from a deity in her dreams last year. Her medical skills are superb. Lu Hinti spoke again. He wanted to introduce her in detail. The ancestor only answered him with a single word. Neither salty nor light. Chapter 109. The ancestor only replied with a single word. Luxian Emperor couldn't see anything from the ancestor's reply, nor could he guess anything. Although Lu Hinti was unwilling, this place was really too cold for him. It was so cold that he almost couldn't stand. Before he directly turned into an ice sculpture, he could only choose to leave. The ancestor was meditating. He didn't eat or drink. The hall was so cold that even mosquitoes and flies didn't enter. Naturally, there was no need to fan him to drive the mosquitoes away. The room was also so clean that it was as if it had been washed with alcohol. Not to mention dust. Even germs couldn't be found. In this kind of situation, Ning Xuemo really didn't know what she was supposed to do. She stood in place for a while and looked at the young girls and boys. They were all like wooden sculptures with their eyes slightly closed and heads lowered, as if they were also meditating. These people's cultivation was obviously not low. When they were meditating, even their breathing couldn't be heard. The entire hall was so quiet that it was like a tomb for the living dead. Not a single sound could be heard. Ning Xuemo was going crazy. This ancestor came all the way here just to occupy this palace and pretend to be an ice sculpture? It was fine if he wanted to pretend to be an ice sculpture, but he shouldn't drag her into it. She had been tossing and turning until now and hadn't had a good night's sleep. She was very sleepy and missed the new big bed in her residence. Moreover, the injuries on her body hadn't completely healed. Now that she had been standing for a long time, the injury on her back was faintly aching. Xuema, meditate. Ji Yunhuang's voice came from beside her ear. It came from his mouth and directly entered her ears. No one else could hear it. Ning Xuema glanced at Ji Yunhuang beside her, and found that he had also closed his eyes and was meditating. His cultivation was high. Even though they were so close, Ning Xuema couldn't hear his breathing. Meditating while standing? Please forgive her for not knowing how to do it. She would rather go back and be a corpse than be an ice sculpture here. Ning Xuema smiled faintly. Suddenly, she stepped forward and said, "Ancestor, is there anything you need Xuema to do?" Her voice was clear and melodious, like a stream splashing down on a rock, breaking the deathly silence here, like the first flower blooming on the icy plains. No one had ever dared to speak while the ancestor was meditating. Ji Yunhuang's expression changed slightly, but it was too late to stop him. The others were like ice sculptures that had come back to life. They opened their eyes one after another and stared at the person who dared to make such a ruckus in front of the ancestor. The ancestor, who had been sitting upright all this time, finally opened his eyes. His extremely dark gaze fell on Ning Xuema. He paused for a moment before he slowly opened his mouth. "Are you Ning Xuema?" It turned out that this venerable emperor could also speak a lot. She thought he was a monosyllabic creature. Yes, this humble girl is indeed Ning Xuema. A few days ago, I would like to thank the ancestor for speaking up for Xuema so that Xuema would not have to die unjustly. Thank you very much. Ning Xuema's etiquette was not lacking. She smiled, perfectly revealing 4 small teeth. It was even more standard than the standard smile of an air stewardess. It was even more official and gentle. "You come here." The ancestor said 3 more words. What did he want her to do? Fan him? Massage his shoulders? Or massage his legs? Ning Xuema's mind was filled with questions, but she knew that she could not disobey him. She walked over and stood about 1.5 meters away from him. She bowed and said, "What orders does the ancestor have?" Before she could finish her sentence, her feet seemed to be pulled by something indescribable. She staggered and involuntarily fell into the ancestor's arms. Damn! She did not want to throw herself into the arms of a big ice cube. Chapter 110. Ning Xuema's waist stiffly twisted, her body swaying like a butterfly. In an instant she had already found her balance. Just as she was about to regain her footing, her wrist suddenly tightened, causing her to stagger. Finally she took a big step forward. This step almost caused her to slip into the ancestor's wide white robe. She hurriedly stood still. At this moment, she was less than 10 centimeters away from the D-zone. This distance could only be maintained by the person closest to her. Therefore, Ning Xuema's mind was alarmed. Could it be that this D-zone who looked like a super immortal and super otherworldly was actually a wretched boy lover? This D-zone was really not an ordinary kind of noble and virtuous person. He was actually holding her wrist with a brocade handkerchief. Did he have to be so pretentious? She calmly looked at the Dizun's hand that was holding her wrist. That hand was perfect with slender and smooth fingers like ivory carvings. But it was also as cold as iron. Although there was a snow-white handkerchief between them, the coldness was like a line of ice that drilled into her wrist. It quickly spread up and rushed straight to her heart. Wherever it passed, her blood vessels seemed to be frozen inch by inch. Damn, he wouldn't kill her because of this, right? Naturally, she did not dare to let the coldness from his hand directly invade her heart. Otherwise, her heart would stop beating. Ning Xuema subconsciously mobilized her internal energy to fight against the ice line that suddenly drilled into her body. Unexpectedly, just as her internal energy collided with the invisible ice line, the ice line disappeared without a trace in an instant. Ning Xuema was shaken and almost hurt by her own internal energy. Fortunately, her reaction was quick-witted. As soon as she saw that something was wrong, she immediately rushed her internal energy to the place where the ice line had invaded and reopened the blood vessels there. From an outsider's point of view, the Dizun and Ning Xuema were very close. The Dizun was holding Ning Xuema's wrist while Ning Xuema was almost lying on the Dizun's body. However, they were standing in a strange posture, looking very intimate. Who would have thought that these two people had actually already fought for a round? Ning Xuema had even rolled around the gates of hell and almost died. Your psychokinesis trash. This time Dizun's improvement was even greater. He actually said 6 words. Ning Xuema secretly rolled her eyes. Grandpa, can you not touch the pot that doesn't boil? But there is another kind of power in your body. What is it? The ancestor continued to ask, speaking more words. His breath was extremely cold. When he spoke, it was as if there was a stream of ice flowing around Ning Xuema. This guy's body was so cold, but why wasn't his blood frozen? That was really strange. Being too close to him, the coldness became even more overwhelming. Ning Xuema resisted the urge to shiver and replied, "This is the power that Xuema cultivated. You can call it inner force." Internal force? Dizun repeated softly, his tone unclear. Suddenly he loosened his grip. Ning Xuema's wrist was finally free. She immediately took a step back. Yes, internal force. That is what this humble girl calls it. How did you learn it? It was bestowed by the heavens. Ning Xuema pushed the credit to the heavens again. Anyway, the heavens wouldn't expose her. This was really an all-purpose reason. Dizun was speechless. He looked into her eyes. You're lying. I wouldn't dare. Ning Xuema's eyes were full of sincerity. Xuemo really brought the kung fu with her when she came. She wasn't lying. Cultivating internal force was indeed a kung fu from her world. One was sitting and the other was standing. Ning Xuema looked at the Dizun and suddenly felt that this posture was actually quite advantageous for her. At least she was looking down on him. Chapter 111. The two of them were so close that Ning Xuema could almost count how many eyelashes he had. She didn't know how the ancestor looked like, but his eyelashes were really handsome. They were long, dense, and distinct. He wasn't wearing fake eyelashes, was he? His eyes were as black as ink, as if he was wearing contact lenses. What are you criticizing me for? The ancestor spoke again. What? The ancestor is a man of literary and martial virtues, unifying. Ning Xuema naturally didn't admit it. Her eyes were even clearer and more innocent. She had blurted out a line from Jin Yang's novel. The ancestor asked, unifying what? His voice was indifferent and cold. Well, Xuema is saying that the ancestor is a man of literary and martial virtues, and the whole world is convinced. Ning Xuema promptly changed her words and didn't say unifying Jianghu. The ancestor was so powerful that even the emperors of this continent had to be respectful and wait upon him, not to mention the Jianghu. Unifying Jianghu was no longer a compliment to him, but rather a belittling of his prestige. The ancestor was so fussy that she didn't want to be frozen into an ice sculpture because of a few words. The ancestor looked at her indifferently for a moment and finally let go of her hand. Glib tongue, I don't know. He stopped here and didn't know what to say. Ning Xuema raised her eyes to look at him, but his mask was so tight that she couldn't see his expression and didn't know what he wanted to say. She waited for a moment, but the ancestor didn't say anything else. He slowly wiped his hands with the brocade handkerchief. Ning Shuima was speechless. She took 2 steps back. The ancestor probably doesn't have anything for Shuima to take care of. Shuima will take her leave. The ancestor was wiping his hands with the brocade handkerchief very carefully, 1 finger at a time, even the gaps between his fingers. Hearing her words, he stared at her. He raised his hand and a dark green date flew into Ning Shuima's palm. Eat it. Ning Shuima was an expert in the use of poison. She could tell if something was poisonous or not as soon as she touched it. She held the jujube in her hand and knew that it wasn't poisonous, nor was it poisoned. It was a clean thing, so it shouldn't be a problem for her to eat it. She calmly glanced at the handkerchief that the ancestor had just thrown away. It was obvious that the ancestor had a serious case of mysophobia and disdained to have any physical contact with anyone. Therefore, not only did he use the handkerchief to hold her wrist, he even wiped his hand after holding her wrist. She smiled faintly and used her sleeve to rub the jujube. Only after she had almost wiped off a layer of the jujube's skin did she reluctantly put it into her mouth. After chewing a few times, she smiled like a flower and said, "Many thanks for the jujube, ancestor." The jujube looked extremely green, but it actually tasted extremely sweet and had a strong jujube fragrance, causing her to salivate in an instant. The ancestor was speechless. He looked at the sleeve that had been pulled off by Ning Shuima after she had wiped the jujube and threw it on the ground. Unfortunately, the sleeve was lying next to the handkerchief he had thrown away. The ancestor stared at her face for a moment. Then, he waved his sleeve and the 2 pieces of cloth on the ground disappeared in an instant. 2 groups of airflow appeared and circled around Ning Shuima. Ning Shuima instantly shuddered. She had sharp eyes and saw that the 2 groups of airflow were the handkerchief and sleeve that had already been vaporized. The ancestor's skill really couldn't be underestimated. He could actually vaporize things in an instant. It seemed that he wasn't just an old swindler. He still had some skills. The 2 groups of airflow almost froze her whole body. She desperately mobilized her internal energy to circulate in her body, so that she wouldn't be instantly frozen into an ice sculpture. Chapter 112. The 2 balls of qi almost froze her whole body. She tried her best to circulate her internal energy within her body, so that she would not be frozen into an ice sculpture. However, her face and lips were covered with a layer of white frost, which looked a little scary. Ancestor. The boy behind the ancestor who had once stood up for Ning Shuima bowed. Ancestor, please be lenient. She is only a child. If she has offended ancestor, I hope ancestor can let her go. After all, ancestor had once saved her life. She is actually very grateful. Ji Yunhuang saw that the situation was not good. He hurriedly stepped forward and also bowed to plead for leniency. Under the mask, the ancestor's eyes flashed. He said indifferently, "Why would this ancestor lower himself to the same level as a child? This ancestor is only testing her martial arts." His sleeves moved slightly and the 2 balls of qi that were revolving around Ning Shuima floated out of the main hall through the crack in the door. A low cry came from outside, and then there was no more movement. Although you are a waste, you are not completely useless. Go. The ancestor finally let her go. However, his words were somewhat malicious. In a situation where the enemy was strong and she was weak, Ning Shuima was naturally not stupid enough to go against him. Therefore, she smiled and said, "Many thanks to the ancestor. I bought a watch last year. The ancestor is really a god." Shuima excused herself. She turned around and left. The ancestor did not understand one of her words. While he was distracted, Ning Shuima had already opened the door. His eyes flashed with a strange light. This little girl was clearly a waste, but she had a proud and unyielding character. What was even more strange was that her physique was different from ordinary people. Unexpectedly, she was not injured by his glacier palm. Ning Shuima walked out of the door. Outside, the sun was shining brightly. The warmth of the sun shone on her body. She could not help but face the sun and stretch her body. But as she stretched, she paused. The 2 fan-shaped rows of flower-like youths outside the door were still there, and they were still standing in such a neat and orderly manner. After such a long time, they were still in the same position as when Ning Shuima went in. It seemed that this venerable emperor was not just a little strict with his subordinates, as expected of a man who had lived for nearly 2,000 years. Not only was he old-fashioned and cold like a coffin board, but he was also a man who had lived for nearly 2,000 years. Even his subordinates had been trained to behave like this. They were like a bunch of moving coffin boards. Her gaze fell on an ice sculpture not far from the door. His eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't remember seeing any ice sculptures at the entrance when she went in. Moreover, this ice sculpture was too lifelike. Its eyebrows, eyes, nose, and mouth were all extremely lifelike. Even the clothes it was wearing were no different from those of the palace guards. This guard looks a little familiar. She had seen him by the emperor's side just now. Ning Shuima looked at his half-open mouth and widened eyes. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be that this was not an ice sculpture but a real person? Was he frozen by the demonic wind created by the venerable sovereign? She couldn't help but want to go up and take a look. Miss, he is sealed in ice. Within 24 hours, he will be unsealed. He cannot be moved. One of the youths stopped her and said in a low voice. That voice was really low. Only Ning Shuima could hear it. It was obvious that this place needed absolute silence. These youths did not dare to open their mouths and could only use their telepathy skills. As expected, it was the demonic wind created by that old swindler. Who would have thought that the demonic wind would be so powerful that it could turn a person into a block of ice in an instant? Was this the realm of an expert in psychokinesis? It was so mysterious that it made people want to grind their teeth. Chapter 113. She also wanted to reach this height. Then she would subdue this old swindler. She would freeze him, freeze him, and melt him again. Who asked him to act pretentious and arrogant again? She would step on his back and sing the song of conquest, so that he would never be able to turn over again. Unfortunately, her little body had a psychokinesis trash physique. Thinking about it really made people wring their hands. That's right, she remembered that her physique didn't have any psychokinesis in the beginning. Now she more or less had a bit of it. Did this mean that her physique wasn't completely hopeless? Perhaps if she took good care of it, her aptitude could be improved by another step? Ning Shuima pondered as she walked outside. Just as she walked past a few palace gates, someone suddenly shouted in front of her, "The emperor has arrived." She raised her head and saw a group of palace servants escorting Lu Hinti as he strode toward her. Ning Shuima cursed in her heart. She had met a lot of people from the imperial family recently, and she had also met the emperor frequently. She could only salute. Lu Hinti waved his hand to let her get up. His gaze swept over her body and he was somewhat surprised. "Didn't I ask you to serve the ancestor inside? Why did you come out? What was there to serve? She was just a block of wood and ice, okay?" Ning Shuima cursed in her heart, but on the surface, she was still obedient. "Your Majesty, the ancestor asked me to come out." He probably saw that Shuima's body was weak, so he empathized with Shuima and let her out. Lu Hinti's eyes moved slightly. In fact, every time the ancestor went on an inspection tour, no matter which country he went to, he would have two of the most important people in the palace accompany him. Although it was said that they were to serve him, it was more like they were hostages. Only when the ancestor left would the two people regain their freedom. He didn't expect that Ning Shuima would come out less than an hour after she went in. The ancestor was cold-hearted and never easily empathized with people. Saying that he pitied Ning Shuima because of her weak body? Anyone who had a little understanding of the ancestor wouldn't believe it. Perhaps the ancestor felt that her status was too low to be used as a hostage, and that Yun Huang alone was enough? Or maybe the Dizun was the one who taught Ning Shuima kung fu in her dream, so he let her go. Lu Hinti had a hard time guessing. He glanced at Ning Shuima and his heart skipped a beat. Wherever the venerable sovereigns were, there was a kind of aura that no ordinary person could get close to. Furthermore, this atmosphere was extremely strange. Only young boys and girls were allowed to stay inside for a long time. If one lost their virginity, once they entered the hall, they would feel a bone-chilling coldness. That coldness was bone-chilling. With his cultivation, he was almost frozen to the point of being unable to walk after staying inside for a while. When he came out, he had to surround the stove and shiver for a long time before he recovered. Apart from the people around the ancestor, even if a virgin boy or girl went in, If they didn't have strong skills, they would be frostbitten within an hour. They would need to rest for a while to recover. This girl was clearly a psychokinesis trash. She had been in there for an hour, but she was still alive and kicking. What in the world was going on? Luxian Emperor discovered that this little girl, who had a pair of limpid eyes, had a lot of mysteries surrounding her body. It made him want to keep her by his side and investigate her thoroughly. Shuama, I wronged you before. Your father used to be my right-hand man. You are a loyal person, so I will really compensate you. What do you want? Lu Hinti's tone was kind and warm. One who was unaccountably solicitous was hiding evil intentions. Especially when the emperor was solicitous, who knew what he wanted. Chapter 114. Ning Shuama was slightly alarmed. She took a step back and said with a smile, "Thank you, Your Majesty. How about I double the 10,000 taels of gold?" Lu Hinti was speechless. Was money the only thing in this girl's head? She was really just a child. She didn't know what was best. Shuama, gold is just an inanimate object. If you have a certain status, wouldn't things like gold be easy for you? Lu Hinti guided her patiently. Could it be that the old emperor regretted and wanted to give her another marriage? Give her a prince? No way. She wasn't interested in a prince or anything. She tilted her head and smiled. Shuama is still young and doesn't have big ambitions. I'm not interested in being an official. Well, if Your Majesty still feels that you owe Shuama something, you can double the amount of gold. She looked up at the sun in the sky. It was just past noon and the sun was burning hot above her head. She squinted her eyes and yawned slightly. However, she seemed to have thought of something and covered her mouth with her small hand. She blinked her eyes and said with an embarrassed face, "Your Majesty, I'm sorry. Shuama is too sleepy and has been impolite in front of you. Your Majesty won't blame Shuama for this, right?" Lu Hinti was speechless. In front of so many people, how could he make things difficult for a child because of such a small matter? A dark light flashed in his eyes and he smiled generously. Of course not. Since you're sleepy, go back and have a good rest. Thank you, Your Majesty. Shuama will take her leave. Lu Hinti stood there and watched her small back gradually disappear in front of him. She was smart and clever, shrewd and eccentric. She also had good medical skills. Although her body hadn't fully developed, her appearance was that of a beauty. It would be a pity if such a talent fell into the hands of an ordinary family. However, if he let Huang accept her, he would be criticized. She wasn't worthy of his Huang. Therefore, he could only little girl, the reward will come soon. It will definitely give you a big surprise. Because the news that Ning Shuama was still alive had not reached Marquis Jingyuan's mansion, when Ning Shuama swaggered into Marquis Jingyuan's mansion, it caused quite a stir. After the commotion, it was time to celebrate. Marquis Jingyuan's mansion was bustling with noise and excitement. Even though she had only gone missing for 2 days, it was also an exceptionally torturous 2 days for the servants of the Marquis of Jingyuan's mansion. Those maids who had just been hired to protect the courtyard thought that Ning Shuama had already died and couldn't see any hope, so they left one after another. When Ning Shuama returned, other than old Zhong, there were 2 guards, 2 maids, and a kitchen. Ning Shuama rewarded them for their loyalty in front of everyone without hesitation, and doubled their wages immediately. Ning Shuama's monthly allowance was already higher than others. Now that she had doubled it, everyone was naturally grateful. Ning Shuama took the opportunity to set the rules. She only recruited loyal servants, righteous servants, and brave servants. When their master was in trouble, those who left their master would never be recruited. When this rule came out, those who stayed were naturally overjoyed and became even more loyal. As for those who left, when they heard that Ning Shuama had returned, they were directly rejected by the Marquis Jingyuan's mansion. It was difficult for them to take a step into the Marquis's mansion. They regretted it so much that they wanted to bang their heads against the wall. After Ning Shuama returned, she naturally went to see Tom, the chastity-testing beast. Tom's face was like the end of the world. Its only confidant was also dead. It was full of a bored expression. Seeing Ning Shuama suddenly appear, it almost couldn't believe its own big eyes. With a cry, it banged its head against the iron cage and directly hit its head. Chapter 115. The two of them had a lively conversation. Ning Shuama briefly told Tom about her experience and what happened in the prison of the Ministry of Justice. She was not afraid that Tom would tell on her. First of all, it was her friend now. Second of all, even if it told others, they would not understand. Tom was frightened and even slapped the cage with its paws when it heard the story. Perverts. They are all perverts. The people of the royal family are not good people. Especially the old emperor. He actually treated the daughter of a meritorious official like that. His conscience is really bad. And that princess, she is not a good person either. Ning Shuama glanced at it. Don't overturn a boat with one pole. In fact, His Highness the Crown Prince is quite good. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have been able to turn things around. Tom opened its big eyes and said, he is indeed not bad. Hey, don't tell me you have feelings for him? You are speaking for him, but he is actually just a pretty boy. Ning Shuama rolled her eyes and said, you are the one who has feelings for him. I am just speaking the truth. I don't have any feelings for him. Besides, I don't want to stay in this world forever. I have to find a way to go back. Go back? You wish. We are all transmigrated. How can we go back? Tom could not lift its spirits inside again. I have had enough of this stupid society. It is backward, ignorant, and unable to communicate. It is not as humane as our society. Ning Shuama touched its big head and said, don't be sad. Maybe we still have a chance to go back. Don't touch my head. Hey, what did you say? We still have a chance to go back. Its eyes opened wide again. Ning Shuama nodded and said, I have been reading some books in the Crown Prince's mansion for the past 2 days. I accidentally saw some information about the space-time tunnel. As long as our martial arts practice to a certain level, we can find the space-time tunnel. Maybe we can go back to our time. Tom was shocked. The space-time tunnel should exist. There was such a saying in our time. But no one has ever found it. It seemed to have thought of something and said dejectedly, even if we find it, it is useless. If you really transmigrate back, at least you'll still be a human. But I'm a beast. If I really transmigrate back like this, I'm afraid I'll scare a lot of people. The scientific community will also capture me and use me as a test subject. No matter how it thought about it, its future was bleak. Ning Shuama glanced at it. Look at you, you're so useless. Have you forgotten that beasts can also cultivate? If a fox can cultivate into a fox spirit and have a human skin, why can't you do the same? In any case, you've already gained sentience, so you should be able to cultivate with twice the result with half the effort. Once you've cultivated into a human form, what are you afraid of? Tom's eyes brightened. For the first time since he had crossed over, he had hope. Well, I'll try to practice too, but I can't read the books of this world. Don't worry about that. I got some books on cultivation from the Crown Prince. I'll translate them for you later. Ning Shuama promised generously. Since they were both transmigrators, she still had some feelings for this fellow countryman. Tom's eyes lit up even more. Great. Moi. Finally it said a sentence in Chinese. Ning Shuama flicked its nose. Moi. Ning Shuama was very generous. When she returned safely, she immediately ordered a big banquet to be held regardless of seniority. The master and servant reveled. In Chongkong country, there was no master and servant drinking at the same table. Chapter 116. In Chongkong country, there was no such thing as a master and servant drinking at the same table, so Ning Shuama's actions undoubtedly made these people very moved. She was straightforward in her work, clear in her rewards and punishments, and had good manners. At such a young age, she had more strength of character than those aristocratic family heads. After a few interactions, everyone respected her and was willing to work under her. After the master and servant banquet, Ning Shuama ordered people to go out and put up a recruitment notice. On it were written the rules and conditions of employment, because the price she offered was high and there were old servants desperately advertising in front of the notice. In less than 2 hours, more than 10 people came to join her. Ning Shuama sent old Zhong to explain the rules of the Marquis mansion as usual. After all the new people agreed, she signed the employment contract with them. In less than half a day, the Marquis mansion was back on the right track and was even more lively than before. After the meeting was over, old Zhong frowned and said, "Young miss, after the monthly salary is given out, We don't have much money left. I'm afraid we won't be able to last much longer. Ning Xuema smiled. Don't worry, someone will send us money very soon. Old Zhong was flabbergasted. Young Miss was all alone here. And that scum of a husband had broken off the engagement. Who would send her money? Before he finished thinking, he suddenly heard the sound of ceremonial music coming from outside, coming from the direction of the Marquis mansion. A moment later, someone ran in from outside to report, "Young Miss, the imperial edict has arrived." Ning Xuema smiled and stood up. "The gold is here. Let's go and receive the edict." Ning Xuema never knew that her peach blossoms would be so luxuriant. It was simply to a terrifying extent, making her want to curse. Everyone said that transmigrated women had many peach blossoms, but wasn't this too much? It had only been a few days since she transmigrated, and she had already attracted 3 big peach blossoms. The 6th prince and the crown prince were fine. In any case, they were young and handsome men. But what was the matter with the old emperor? He actually issued an edict to make her his concubine. And what kind of beast concubine was that? Beast his sister. He was a beast, his whole family were beasts. The one who came to deliver the imperial edict was Eunuch Lu, the head of the imperial household. Not only did he bring the imperial edict, but he also brought countless gifts. They flowed in like water, almost filling up the entire hall. After he finished reading the imperial edict, his old face smiled like a chrysanthemum that had just bloomed in the wind. "Congratulations, Your Highness. From now on, Your Highness can be considered to have reached the heavens in a single bound. These are all betrothal gifts from the royal family. They are very impressive." His Majesty sympathizes with Nyang Nyang's difficulties in managing the household alone, so he specially ordered a few palace servants to help Nyang Nyang prepare for the wedding. Nyang only needs to rest and wait for the wedding in 3 days. Ning Xuemo resisted the urge to curse the old emperor and his 8 generations of ancestors. She accepted the imperial edict with a smile and thanked the emperor for his kindness. The old emperor was a lunatic. 2 days ago, he had set a trap for her and wanted to kill her as soon as possible. Now, he had come with great fanfare to ask for her hand in marriage and take her as his concubine. Had his skull been damaged by the venerable sovereign's cold air? Or had he been stimulated by something else? Ning Xuema knew that this was not the time for her to explode. She couldn't even show the slightest bit of unhappiness, so she pretended to be pleasantly surprised and happily accepted the imperial edict. She even rewarded Eunuch Lu with an ingot of gold and sent him away happily. After sending Eunuch Lu off, Ning Xuema turned around and looked at the betrothal gifts in the hall. The old emperor was quite willing to spend a lot of money. The gifts were either gold or silver, and there was also a large chest of jewelry. Chapter 117. The old emperor was quite willing to spend a lot of money. The things he sent were either gold or silver, and there was also a large chest of jewelry. There was also a large pile of coral and jadeite ornaments. Ning Xuema made a rough estimate. These things added up to around 30 to 40,000 taels of gold. It was 2 or 3 times more than the 10,000 taels of gold she asked for. It was already considered very generous. However, the old emperor was also very calculative. If she entered the palace as an imperial concubine, she would need to bring enough dowry. She did not have any other relatives in the palace, so the things he gave her would most likely have to be brought back to the palace. As expected of the emperor, he really had a good plan. But to scheme against her, Ning Xuem, Nyang, these servants will take care of it. Nyang only needs to be a beautiful bride in 3 days. The 4 palace maids left behind by Eunuch Lu came forward, wanting to take care of the gold, silver, and jewelry. Ning Xuemo raised her hand and stopped them. She lightly said, "The 4 of you have just arrived and do not understand the rules of my Marquis Jingyun's household. There is no need to trouble you." "Uncle Zhong." Old Zhong immediately stepped forward. "This old servant is here. Bring some people to exchange these gold and silver for banknotes. Send the jewelry to the storeroom." "Yes." Old Zhong agreed and immediately brought some people to carry the chests. The 4 palace maids looked at each other in dismay. The leader stepped forward. Nyang. His Majesty ordered us to prepare the dowry for Nyang. If she took all the things away, what would they use to prepare the dowry? Ning Xuema smiled. The dimples on her cheeks were like intoxicating wine. Then you can go prepare it yourselves. Try to make it look as good as possible and make it as sumptuous as possible. But Nyang Nyang took all these things away. We servants are unable to prepare them. Did His Majesty say that we must use these betrothal gifts to prepare the dowry? Ning Xuema asked back. That is not the case. Then it is. Since these things were given to me by His Majesty, then I have absolute control over them. I can use them however I want. You have no right to say anything. Ning Xuema's small face became cold. But what about the dowry? Let's make a salad. Ning Xuema's eyes slightly curved. Whoever gave the order for you to buy the dowry, go find that person for the money. Don't even think about having any ideas about my things. Old Zhong was very efficient. In just a few moments all the boxes in the hall had been moved out. Although the 4 palace maids knew a little bit of martial arts, it was obviously not enough in front of the guards brought by Old Zhong. Besides, they didn't dare to really take action and snatch it. In their anger, they hurried back to the palace to report. Lu Hinti was reviewing memorials in the imperial study. He first listened to Eunuch Lu's report. Eunuch Lu was very reliable and eloquent. He reported all of Ning Xuema's reactions and words in detail. Lu Hinti nodded slightly. He thought that the little girl would show an unhappy expression. After all, she was now very close to the crown prince Jiyunhuang. In her heart, she might even have thoughts of becoming the crown prince's consort. He didn't expect her to agree so readily and like it so much. Of course, even if she didn't agree and didn't like it, she couldn't go against the imperial edict. However, to be able to agree so readily made Lu Hinti look better. At least that little girl is tactful. She knows when to advance and retreat. Or maybe she knows that she is a good-for-nothing and doesn't deserve Huang. So it's good that she can find a higher branch to marry. For a weak and lonely girl like her to be able to marry into the palace as a consort, she must have burned incense for 8 lifetimes. One had to know that when the daughters of many officials married into the palace, they were only nobles or something like that. It was a few ranks lower than a consort. At least he didn't let her father down. Besides, he wasn't old. He was only 43 years old. Because of his body's magical power, he didn't look old. He looked like he was in his 30s, which was the age when he was full of charm. Perhaps that girl really did have feelings for him. He couldn't help but look at the bronze mirror in front of the imperial table. The bronze mirror reflected a handsome face. His eyebrows were like swords, his eyes were like phoenixes, his nose was like a gallbladder, his lips were square, and there was a slight beard at the side of his lips. It made him look even more handsome and dignified. Chapter 118. His appearance genes were undoubtedly outstanding. Otherwise, he wouldn't have given birth to a bunch of handsome sons. Although his appearance wasn't as outstanding as Ji Yunhuang's, he was still considered very handsome. Otherwise, he wouldn't have so many beauties in his harem falling for him. Even when he went out incognito, there were still 16 beauties who became lovesick because of him. Therefore, that little girl being able to marry him as his concubine could be considered climbing up the social ladder. Head steward Lu looked at Lu Hinti in horror as he looked at himself in the mirror. For a moment, he couldn't figure out what the usually cold and arrogant emperor was thinking. At this moment, the 4 palace maids returned and told him how Ning Xuema had put away all the betrothal gifts and didn't let them handle them. Lu Hinti laughed in his heart. It seemed that the little girl was afraid of being poor. She didn't have an ordinary passion for gold and silver. It wasn't out of his expectations that she wouldn't let others handle it. She was so greedy, so she definitely wouldn't be willing to throw those things in the Marquis mansion. When she married, she would still bring them over. It was fine as long as she had a plan. With a plan, he could subdue her and make her only serve him in the future. She would bow down and listen to his every word. He thought for a moment and then allocated some silver to the 4 palace maids to let them prepare Ning Xuema's dowry. They wanted to look more glorious. The 4 palace maids originally thought that he would fly into a rage and punish Ning Xuema for her crimes. They didn't expect that he would settle the matter peacefully. It seemed that His Majesty really doted on this Miss Ning. She hadn't even married into the palace and he was already so obedient to her. If she entered the palace, she would definitely be a favored concubine. Then they couldn't offend that little girl even more. The 4 palace maids were also very good at adapting to the situation. They immediately praised Ningxuoma's beauty and character in unison. Then, they received the imperial edict and went to the palace's treasury to get the silver. There was a set of complicated procedures to withdraw money from the palace. After the 4 palace maids finished the procedures, it was already 4 hours later. The sun was halfway down and the curtain of night was about to fall. When the 4 palace maids returned to the Marquis mansion, they quickly discovered that something was wrong. The main gate of the Marquis mansion was tightly shut and quiet. There wasn't a single sound. They knocked on the door for a long time but no one came out. It was as if it had become an empty house. After all, they were quite knowledgeable. They knew that something was wrong and immediately sent someone to report to the palace. The palace quickly dispatched a team of imperial guards to forcefully break open the main gate of Marquis Jingyuan's mansion. However, the scene inside shocked everyone. The servants of the Marquis of Jingyuan's mansion were all lying on the floor in disorder. Each and every one of them had a pale complexion and were unconscious. Even old Zhong was lying on the table in the main hall. No matter how he was pushed, he wouldn't wake up, as if he was poisoned. Actually, no one cared about the life and death of the servants. What they cared about was the safety of the master of the Marquis estate. Therefore, these people quickly turned the entire Marquis estate upside down. But they didn't see Ningxuoma's shadow. The leader of the imperial guards did not dare to be negligent. He quickly sent someone to the palace to report to Lu Hinti, and quickly invited all kinds of doctors in the city. After a period of tossing and turning, Lu Hinti arrived. Uncle Zhong and the others were also finally rescued and woke up. They were collectively poisoned. Although the poison was fatal, it was a common poison. The doctors in the city were able to cure it. Coupled with the timely rescue, none of them lost their lives. However, when they were asked about Ningxuoma's whereabouts, these people were even more at a loss than the emperor. Everyone said that when Miss Ning was lecturing them on how to manage the affairs of the Marquis' estate in the future, they inexplicably heard a faintly discernible sound of music, followed by a faint fragrance of flowers. Before they could react, they fainted. Chapter 119. Lu Hinti's face was as gloomy as water. That girl most likely ran away from the marriage. He, the emperor above millions of people, was actually forced to run away from his marriage by a little girl. If this were to spread out, where would he put his face? This was simply too shameful. He was afraid that he would become the laughingstock of the continent. That daring girl, did she not know that running away from the imperial family's marriage was a capital offense? After old Zhong finished his confession, he also cried on the ground, "Your Majesty, my family's young miss must have been kidnapped by a strong person. That flower fragrance was probably the poisonous gas released by the strong person. That's why we were poisoned and the young miss was kidnapped. I pity her for being a lonely and helpless girl. I don't know where she's suffering right now. I beg your Majesty to send people to find her as soon as possible. I pity the Marquis for having only one daughter. I originally thought that she would receive the Emperor's appreciation and be conferred the title of Imperial Concubine, reaching the heavens in one step. Who would have thought that she would encounter such a thing?" He wailed and kowtowed. The officials and Imperial guards who came with the Emperor were all moved. At this time, Lu Hinti could only push the boat along with the current and conclude that Ningxuoma was kidnapped by a strong person. After all, saying that she was kidnapped by a strong person would make the imperial family's face look better. Fortunately, whether she ran away from the marriage or was kidnapped by a strong person, it could be considered as having a deeper stain on her record. The former was disobeying the imperial edict and was punishable by death. The latter was ruining her reputation. Regardless of which explanation it was, she could no longer marry the crown prince Ji Yunhuang. He also had a good explanation for his son. However, knowing that the other party ran away from the marriage and still couldn't pursue the matter, Lu Hinti felt as if he had eaten a fly and was extremely unhappy. He really wanted to kill everyone in the Marquis mansion as a warning to that girl. But that girl, in order to escape, did not hesitate to use a fatal poison on everyone. It was obvious that she did not care about the life and death of these people. Even if he killed all of them, that little girl wouldn't be sad at all. Instead, it would make him seem too cruel. Besides, if he were to take his anger out on the innocent, it would be easy for the common people to gossip and impeach him. His breath was stuck in his chest, and he didn't know whether to spit it out or not. This was the first time he had tasted such a cowardly feeling that he could only swallow his broken teeth. He took a deep breath and suppressed the unhappiness in his heart. He asked about the time when Ning Xuema went missing. Old Zhong, on the other hand, told her everything he knew. He said that Miss Ning was afraid of losing the betrothal gift given by the emperor, so she only left behind 1,000 taels of silver. The rest of the betrothal gift was exchanged for banknotes and was kept by Miss Ning. Because young Miss was happy to be conferred the title of imperial concubine, she gathered everyone together and wanted to celebrate together. Unexpectedly, while young Miss was lecturing them, they were ambushed. It has been more than 2 hours since then. Lu Hinti secretly clenched his fists in his sleeves. 2 hours was more than enough time for that girl to escape the city. His eyes slightly flashed and he immediately ordered the entire city to be locked down and martial law was imposed. He ordered people to search for Ning Xuema's whereabouts. Naturally, the people outside the city would not be let off. All the roads were searched, orders were issued one after another. The imperial army, the provincial government's soldiers, the Yaman's bailiffs, everyone who could be used was sent out. Because Ning Xuema had a large amount of banknotes and other items on her when she went missing, there was a possibility that she was robbed by someone who was jealous. Therefore, everyone who had grievances with the Marquis mansion was searched. Chapter 120. Old Zhong knelt on the ground and kowtowed to express his gratitude, but he was silently praying in his heart, "Miss, take care. I have already done everything I can. I will do my best to take care of Marquis Jingyuan's residence. We will wait for your safe return." Ning Xuema wore a beggar's outfit and squatted in a corner. Looking at the soldiers searching the streets, she didn't even have the strength to curse. What was a mistake in 100 plans? What was a careless mistake? It was referring to the current her. Originally, she had planned everything very well, and it could be said to be flawless. First, she changed all the betrothal gifts into banknotes. She carried some with her and secretly gave some to Old Zhong, so that he could still run the Marquis's residence normally after she left. In order not to implicate everyone and to not leak the news, she only told Old Zhong about her escape. Although Old Zhong didn't agree, he now followed Ning Xuema's lead. Whatever Ning Xuema told him to do, he would do. After the master and servant discussed, they used the excuse of being conferred the title of imperial concubine to gather everyone in the hall. Then Old Zhong secretly used poison to poison everyone. To create the illusion that a strong person had come, originally, everything was planned perfectly. She even calculated the old emperor's reaction when he came. She only needed to escape the city and hide in a cave for a few days and everything would be fine. Then she could come back and continue her carefree life. But she didn't expect that in a moment of carelessness when she drugged everyone, she also inhaled some poison powder. Her original body was almost invulnerable to poison because of the constant exposure to poison, but this small body couldn't. It was actually very sensitive to this kind of poison. Although she took the antidote in advance, she still felt dizzy. She forced herself to disguise as a beggar and ran out of the Marquis's residence. However, the poison in her body began to act up. She forced herself to run to a secluded place and sat down in a corner of a small alley. She used her internal energy to force the poison out of her body and unknowingly fainted. She had been unconscious until now. The sky was already dark. Teams of soldiers were searching the streets, causing chaos and chaos. Every city had its dark corners. There were many beggars on the streets, and there were also many who were sleeping by the roadside. Therefore, no one paid any attention to her when she slept on the street. Even when two groups of people passed by her, they didn't notice her. Ning Xuema had secretly sneaked to the city gate to take a look. The inspection at the city gate was extremely strict. Children around the age of 10, regardless of their gender, were the main targets of the inspection. Not only would they verify the appearance of the person in the portrait, they would also let the hounds come forward to sniff the scent. It must be said that the efficiency of the imperial family was quite high. In just a short while, her portraits were plastered all over the city gates. These portraits were quite skillful and looked like oil paintings. They were 70 to 80% similar to her original appearance. And Ning Shuama's disguise technique was not as miraculous as it was said to be. If she were to use a human mask, she could just smear it, pinch it, and fix it. She could even create someone else's appearance. If they didn't look carefully under the light, they could still fool them. However, she didn't have a human skin mask with her now. Tui Dao's face had been discarded because she found it disgusting. Therefore, her current disguise technique was only to darken her small face a little, make her eyes a little smaller, and draw her mouth a little bigger. It was still somewhat similar to her original appearance. Chapter 121. If someone were to scrutinize her face, she would definitely be exposed. Ning Shuama patrolled around the city gate for a while before walking back and sitting down at a place where there were many beggars. She thought that the old emperor must have thought that she had escaped from the city. That was why the soldiers were searching the area outside the city. She was afraid that she would just go through the motions inside the city. It might be safer for her to stay in this group of beggars for a few days. The most dangerous place was the safest place. As a secret agent, she knew this very well. Therefore, she deliberately sat at the corner of a bustling street with a group of beggars. Occasionally, she would even stand up like the other beggars and hold a broken bowl to ask for money from passers-by. In order not to be conspicuous, she almost didn't speak. She was skinny and her face was dirty like a cat's. She looked more like a beggar than a real beggar. Naturally, she wasn't likable. Therefore, the money she asked for was much less than the other beggars. After almost 2 hours, there was only 1 copper coin in her broken bowl. She had always been dedicated to her work. She looked like a dragon or a tiger. Now, she was even more realistic as a beggar than a real beggar. Among the beggars, no one doubted her identity. The world of beggars was actually very competitive. Before the big copper coin in Ning Shuama's broken bowl could warm the bottom of the bowl, a dirty hand reached over and took the copper coin in her bowl. He blew on it and looked at Ning Shuama. "Little girl, are you new here? You should know the rules of this area. You have to pay me for the land. Your Tongzi will belong to me." Ning Shuama lowered her head and didn't fight for it. She seemed to be very scared and took a step back. "Big brother, take it if you want it. In the future, if I want more, I will give some to you. I just hope that you won't chase me away." Her obedience made the beggar very happy. He squinted his eyes and raised his hand to pat Ning Shuama's head. "Little girl, you are quite good at making trouble. Well, from today onwards, I will take care of you." Probably because it was the first time that he had a younger brother, this beggar was very excited. He showed his yellow front teeth and told Ning Shuama his begging experience. Although Ning Shuama really wanted to knock out his yellow teeth one by one, she knew that this was not the time to stir up trouble. Moreover, if she mingled with these beggars, it would be easier for her to conceal herself and evade the search of those soldiers. Ning Shuama, under the guidance of the beggar brother, managed to get a few more copper coins. She only kept 1 for herself and gave the rest to Huang Buk. Teeth Huang was even happier and chatted with her even more happily. While Ning Shuama dealt with him casually, she was also paying attention to the movements of the soldiers who were searching for her. She saw that her uncle and aunt's family, as well as the relatives who had been to her house to ask for money, had all been taken away by the soldiers. Obviously, they had also become suspects in the abduction of Ning Shuama. Ning Shuama laughed in her heart. The old emperor had a tacit understanding with her in this play. He had done everything according to her wishes. He deserved to be praised. None of her relatives were easy to deal with. Now that they had been implicated by her, it could be considered that they had paid back the debt of Ning Shuama who had died unjustly. Even if these people were innocent, the old emperor would definitely put on an act and let people interrogate them strictly for the sake of his face. He might even find a scapegoat among them. This strict interrogation would only involve torture. The torture instruments in the Ministry of Justice's prison were enough to make those people happy for a few days. Chapter 122. These people often bullied the original Ning Shuama and often beat and scolded her. That big cousin sister even pushed the 10-year-old Ning Shuama into the lake in the dead of winter and almost drowned her. Although she was lucky enough to swim to the shore, she also fell seriously ill, which made her body even weaker. These people once made the original Ningshuama live in hell, and now it was time for them to pay back their debts. The sky was already dark and the soldiers on the streets were still searching. These soldiers probably thought that there was a possibility that Ningshuama was disguised as a beggar, and started to pay attention to the weak beggars who were alone. Ningshuama inwardly let out a sigh of relief. Although Buckteeth Huang was noisy and had a bad breath, he was a very good shield. The city gate was already closed and she definitely could not leave the city today. She could only hide in the beggar nest in the city for the night. When she woke up, the sky was slightly bright and the east was faintly showing the white of the fish belly. At this time the city gate should be open. She had to go and see if the inspection of the city gate was lax. She stood up from the smelly beggars and was about to slowly go out. Suddenly a rider galloped from the main street in front of them. A man on the horse shouted, "The officials at Deshanglu are giving out porridge and clothes. Those who are under the age of 13 can get 2 portions. Let's go quickly." A stone stirred up 1,000 ripples and all the hungry beggars stood up and rushed towards Deshang restaurant like a swarm of bees. Ningshuama's heart moved. She was a smart person and immediately knew that this was a trap. It seemed that the officials did not find anyone in the inns and finally started to think of all the beggars. Gathering all the beggars in one place would naturally make it easier to find them. If she went, she would be recognized very quickly. If she did not go, when all the beggars rushed towards the same direction, she would be even more conspicuous as a beggar. It seemed that the imperial guards who were in charge of this search were not completely incompetent. She was slightly distracted and the yellow teeth who was resting beside her stretched out his hand to pull her. "Little brother, why are you still in a daze? Deshang restaurant's food is very delicious. You are definitely not 13 years old, right? Let's go and get 2 portions." In front of and behind her, there were soldiers patrolling the streets, paying attention to these beggars. At this time Ningshuama naturally couldn't be left behind, so she could only follow Yellow Teeth and run forward. Along the way, there were more and more beggars. Ningshuama was not conspicuous among them. She was thinking of ways to escape. When she passed by the gate of a noble's mansion, she saw a rather luxurious carriage parked there from afar. There were 2 guards standing in front of the carriage. It was obvious that some noble in this mansion was going out. She looked around and saw the lantern hanging from the carriage. There were 2 words on the lantern, "How Mansion." Ningshuama suddenly realized that this place was actually the 6th prince, Ji Yunhao's Hao Palace. Because he had been beaten yesterday and was demoted to a commoner, the signboard at the entrance of the palace had been taken down and replaced with Hao Palace. The lanterns of Hao Palace had also been changed to Hao Palace lanterns. Could it be that Ji Yunhao wanted to leave the city today? Maybe she could have some ideas on him. Her mind moved quickly. Seeing that she was about to pass by the carriage, she suddenly clutched her stomach. "Ouch, my stomach hurts. Big brother, you go first. I'll find a place to relieve myself first. I'll go later. You can help me line up." Chapter 123. Her thoughts moved very quickly. Just as she was about to pass by the carriage, she suddenly clutched her stomach. "Ouch, my stomach hurts. Big brother, you go first. I'll go find a place to relieve myself first. I'll go later. You help me line up." She shook off Huang Braid's hand and ran to the dark corner of the wall. "Little bastard, you're really a lazy donkey. Hurry up. If you're late, you won't be able to get anything." Huang Braid exhorted her from behind. He didn't want to wait for her and ran away on his own. He was an old fox and knew that there was a limit to the amount of porridge distributed by the government. If he was late, he was afraid that he wouldn't even be able to get the soup. They only cared about running forward. They didn't know where a small stone came from, but it hit the leg of the person running in front. That person cried out in pain and fell flat on his face. The people following him couldn't keep their footing and were tripped by him. This caused a chain reaction, and a large number of people fell down with a pi-pi-pa-pa-pa sound. Curses were heard everywhere. The movements of these beggars naturally alerted the 2 guards who were guarding the carriage. The 2 of them swept their gazes over there and saw the group of beggars in a sorry state. They couldn't help but laugh and take a few glances at the commotion. What they didn't notice was that a small black shadow took advantage of this fleeting opportunity to drill into the bottom of the carriage and quietly attached itself to the wooden planks of the bottom of the carriage. A moment later, 6th Prince Ji Yunhao was indeed carried out in a soft and delicate manner. Behind him was a group of crying concubines. After Ji Yunhao got out of the sedan, the group of concubines surrounded him and cried to express their reluctance to part. Ji Yunhao's handsome face was cold and he didn't pay attention to them. With the help of the 2 guards, he boarded the carriage. "Prince, why do you have to set off so early? Your injuries haven't healed yet, so you don't need to be in such a hurry. The emperor also ordered you to delay it for a few days." A concubine grabbed his robe and cried, "Shut up. What did I say? I'm now a commoner. I'm not some prince. Do you want me to commit the crime of disobeying the imperial edict?" Ji Yunhao's voice was cold as he reprimanded him. That concubine didn't dare to say anything else. The other concubine said, "Wang, Master, please calm down. Sister is just worried about Master." "Master, don't worry. Master, the emperor will definitely not let Master continue to be wronged like this. After this storm, Master will definitely come back. Master, don't worry. We sisters will definitely take care of the affairs of the residents properly and wait for Master to return." These words were quite sensible. Ji Yunhao's complexion improved a bit. "That's more like it," he said indifferently. "Let's all go back." He turned around and entered the carriage. No matter how reluctant the concubines were, there was nothing they could do. They stood at the door and watched as the carriage gradually disappeared into the distance. Because Ji Yunhao was exiled, the carriage he rode in was an ordinary luxurious one, not a prince's carriage. He couldn't bring more than 2 servants with him, otherwise, it wouldn't be in line with the royal system. Fortunately, the 2 people who followed him were his most trusted personal guards. Not only were their martial arts first class, they were also very capable. At this moment, the coachman who was pretending to be him was sitting in front. Ji Yunhao sat in the carriage. The injuries on his body were not light. Although the imperial physicians in the palace gave him the best medicine, he wouldn't be able to recover in a short period of time. At this moment he was still in pain. If he moved a little, the pain would penetrate his heart. That girl must have added something to the torture sticks. Otherwise it wouldn't be so painful. Even after he let the imperial physicians examine him, not a single one of them could tell that he had been poisoned. Chapter 124. That wound was obviously several times more painful than a normal stick wound, but the inspection did not reveal anything. Ever since he received that fat beating, he had not slept a wink. It hurts. The severe pain made him unable to sleep at all, and he had endured until now. Drowsiness plus pain made his temper irritable, and Ning Shuama's face could not help but appear in his mind. Bright eyes, captivating red lips, 2 dimples when she smiled. Her appearance was obviously so lovable, but her temperament. She was simply a little freak, a little demon. He did not expect that this time he would fall into the hands of a little girl. It really made him gnash his teeth in hatred. If he catches that little demon again, he must do what? Ji Yunhao's mind was suddenly at a loss. He hated that girl to death, but it was difficult for him to forget her. Whenever he closed his eyes, he would see her smiling face and innocent little eyes. There had never been a woman who could occupy his heart like this, making him unable to forget her. He was thinking about her so much, probably because he was not reconciled to the fact that he suffered at her hands. When he finds a way to get his revenge, he would probably forget about her. If he catches her, he must first fiercely whip her, and then press her down. He wants her to completely surrender to him, and there will be no one else in her eyes. The speed of the carriage was not slow. In less than a quarter of an hour, it was already approaching the city gate. In the morning, there were many people leaving the city, but the soldiers were still searching very carefully. Not only did they check the inside of the carriage, they also searched the bottom of the carriage where people might be hiding. Ji Yunhao lifted the curtain of the carriage, glanced at the city gate in the distance, then lowered the curtain, sighed, and leaned back on the stool. Where would that girl escape to? Although he had been living in the mansion, but he was still very well informed. He already knew that Ning Shuama was bestowed a marriage and then went missing. Before he could finish his thought, he suddenly felt a chill behind him. An ice-cold object was pressed against his neck. "If you don't want to die, don't scream." A low voice sounded in his ear. Ji Yunhao's body slightly stiffened. He slowly turned his head around. Reflected in his eyes was a little kitten's face and a pair of lively big eyes. Ning Shuema. Cover me or I'll kill you. Ning Shuema's words were very sharp. The knife in her hand moved slightly forward, and a line of blood flowed down Ji Yunhao's neck. She originally wanted to climb under the carriage to sneak out, but she did not expect that the soldiers would not even let go of the bottom of the carriage. They would crawl under the carriage to check. She had no choice but to take the risk and fight for a chance of survival. Ji Yunhao should also be very afraid of death, right? She was confident that she could kill him and bury him with her before he called for the guards. Master, we're about to reach the city gate. Are you doing well inside? Suddenly, a guard's voice came from outside the carriage. Obviously, that person's ears were very sharp. He heard a little noise and became suspicious, so he asked. Ning Shuema's expression changed slightly. If Ji Yunhao's answer was slightly incorrect, the guards would probably rush in to take a look. I'm fine. You guys can continue to drive the carriage outside. Ji Yunhao suddenly opened his mouth. His voice was steady and calm. Yes. The two guards disguised as coachmen stopped talking and focused on driving the carriage. So tactful? Ning Shuema suspiciously looked at him, but she still ordered in a low voice. When we reach the city gate, you will reveal your identity in the carriage. You are a prince, so they definitely won't enter the carriage to check on you. Chapter 125. Right now I'm just a commoner. Right now, the guards at the city gate are the bailiffs of the Supreme Court. They won't listen to anyone and will inevitably lift the curtain to take a look. Ji Yunhao also spoke in a low voice. His finger pointed to a chest at the side. There are manservant clothes over there. You should quickly change into them and pretend to be one of my attendants. You should be able to muddle your way through. He was actually willing to help her? Did this guy change after being beaten with a stick? But this time she didn't have much time to think. The knife in her hand paused slightly and once again approached his throat. Open your mouth. Ji Yunhao's eyes slightly darkened, but as expected, he obediently opened his mouth. His throat felt cold as something rolled down his throat. It was like a line of ice entering his stomach. Don't play tricks. I gave you the soul-severing pill. If you don't have the antidote, it will take your life in one day. No one will be able to cure it. Ning Shuema finally withdrew the knife. Ji Yunhao lowered his eyes and sighed. Shuema, don't worry. I don't want you to be captured more than anyone else. His imperial father would take in concubines once every 3 years. There was no lack of 11 or 12-year-old children among them. He didn't care. Sometimes, in order to curry favor with his father, he would send some beautiful women into the palace. But Ning Shuema couldn't do it. He couldn't let her enter the imperial harem and become his little stepmother. Ning Shuema also felt that he probably didn't want her to become his little stepmother. Her eyelashes curved as she said, I'll believe you for the time being. She opened the chest. Sure enough, there were 2 sets of manservant clothes inside. They were clean and new. Looking at the length, they were actually about the same height as her. Ji Yunhao didn't bring any manservant with him. Why did he bring manservant clothes? This question turned in Ning Shuema's mind for a moment before she put it aside. They were about to reach the city gate. She didn't have much time left. She was actually wearing a tight-fitting undergarment underneath her beggar's clothes, so she didn't avoid changing her clothes under Ji Yunhao's gaze. She quickly took off her beggar's clothes and changed into the manservant's clothes. Then she took a wet towel from the side and wiped her small face clean. She then combed her hair into the manservant's hairstyle. Ji Yunhao half sat there looking at her, watching her as if she was performing a magic trick. In the blink of an eye, she had completely changed her attire and appearance. Her ink-black hair covered her forehead, half covering her eyes. She slightly pursed her small lips, looking just like a manservant. She stuffed the huazi clothes into the box. Ning Shuema had spent half the night among the beggars, so she was a little smelly. However, this carriage actually had its own fragrance. Not long after Ning Shuema entered, the smelly smell disappeared, and the carriage was still fragrant and pleasant. Ning Shuema's gaze shifted as she used her hand to touch the carriage. Aromatic wood. This royal family really knows how to enjoy life. The carriage is actually made of fragrant wood. It must be known that in this continent, A piece of fragrant wood that was 1 square meter was worth thousands of gold taels. In other words, the wood of this carriage was worth tens of thousands of gold taels. This sixth prince was demoted to a commoner, but the carriage he used was also worth so much. Ji Yunhao was half lying on the brocade mattress. Pretend to fan me. At this time, Ning Xuema naturally didn't want to go against him. Sure enough, she took a fan from the side and gently fanned him. She lowered her eyes and fanned him very professionally. If one ignored the sharp knife she secretly pressed on the left side of his waist, she was no different from a real manservant. I have to call one of them to come in and let them know of your existence. Otherwise we will be exposed when they check. Ji Yunhao said in a low voice. Chapter 126. What he said was the truth. When the curtains were opened during the inspection, if the two guards suddenly saw her, there would definitely be a change. Ning Xuema's eyes turned and she readily agreed. Okay. Ji Yunhao was somewhat puzzled as he stared at her. Aren't you afraid that I'll take this opportunity to call them in to deal with you? Ning Xuema smiled. Your little life is still in my hands. I believe that you won't be so stupid. The knife in her hand was definitely faster than his shout. Moreover, she had also fed him poison which could only be neutralized by her unique antidote. Smart girl. Ji Yunhao secretly sighed. He lightly clapped his hands and a guard immediately opened the curtains and came in. Master, you. When he suddenly saw Ning Xuema, his expression changed. A light flashed in his palm and a long sword flashed. He's my Tong Er Junxing. Do you hear me? Ji Yunhao indifferently said, successfully stopping the guard from making trouble. The person who could be his personal guard was naturally very perceptive. He immediately replied, Master, don't worry. Number 2 understands. You can leave. Ji Yunhao waved his hand. Yes. Number 2 bowed his head and left the carriage. Ning Xuema's eyes slightly flashed. It seemed that this sixth prince was not a complete idiot. He was able to train this kind of shadow guard. He still had some ability. The carriage quickly arrived at the city gate. The guards at the gate came to inquire about the owner of the carriage. During this time the guards quickly checked the bottom of the carriage to make sure that no one was hiding there. Only then did they withdraw. The two guards driving the carriage explained Ji Yunhao's identity. The guards at the gate were very conscientious. They bowed. We didn't know that this was Sixth Master's carriage. We have offended you. However, the emperor ordered that all carriages that pass by, regardless of whether they are royalty or nobles, must be carefully inspected. We ask for Sixth Master's forgiveness. His meaning was to open the curtains and let them take a look. After all, this carriage did not indicate that it belonged to the sixth prince's residence. It also did not mean that the person inside was the sixth prince, Ji Yunhao. Ji Yunhao slowly opened his mouth. Open the curtains and let them take a look. Because Ji Yunhao often went out of the city, these city guards all recognized him. At this moment when they heard his voice, they immediately knew that it was indeed him inside. The news that he was punished because of Ning Xuema in the imperial palace had already spread throughout the city, and these soldiers also knew about it. If it were any other nobles, they would believe that Ning Xuema could be brought out, but Ji Yunhao, he probably hated that girl to the bone, so he naturally wouldn't do such a thing. As a result, the soldiers guarding the city relaxed. They only glanced into the carriage after the guards opened the curtains as a matter of routine. The interior of the carriage wasn't complicated and could be seen at a glance. Ji Yunhao lazily reclined in the carriage. Beside him, there was only a young servant fanning him. There was nothing wrong with it. All the soldiers thought to themselves, a descendant of the royal family is indeed a descendant of the royal family. Even if he is demoted, he still has the same attitude and enjoys it. I'm afraid that this demotion is just for show. Soon he will still be the honorable sixth prince. These soldiers naturally didn't dare to make things difficult for Ji Yunhao. They hurriedly bowed and said a few words of apology and atonement before finally releasing the carriage. Where are you going? The road was filled with tall and lush green trees. The sound of horse hooves was crisp and clear, breaking through the morning fog. They were already 7 or 8 li away from the city. Along the way they encountered several groups of people searching for them, but they were all easily sent away by Ji Yunhao. Ning Xuema was unprecedentedly safe by his side. Chapter 127. Ningshuama had a feeling that life was like a play to her now that her mortal enemy had become the person who had helped her escape from danger. She saw that there was a large mountain on the left in front of her, and a hazy silhouette appeared in the misty morning light. However, this carriage was about to turn to the right, in the opposite direction of the large mountain. Ningshuama waved her hand towards Ji Yunhao. "Sixth Prince, this time you saved me, so I won't bicker with you about your previous schemes against me. We're even now. The Green Mountain doesn't change, the Green Mountain flows forever. We'll never meet again." She turned around and was about to jump off the carriage. Ji Yunhao raised his hand and pulled on the corner of her clothes. With a smile that wasn't a smile, he said, "How are we even now? I gave you 3 lashes of the whip, and you gave me 80 strokes of the rod. Our previous grievances are even, but this time I saved you. No matter how you look at it, you owe me a favor." Ningshuama pulled back her clothes. "You also schemed against me and sent me to prison. If I wasn't quick-witted, I would have died in there. The one who schemed against you and sent you to prison wasn't me, but someone else. You're so smart, could it be that you can't figure out who the mastermind is?" Ji Yunhao looked at her with a gloomy gaze. "Of course I know who the mastermind is, but you can't escape your contribution in adding fuel to the fire. Besides, you still owe me a life. It's already good enough that I didn't ask for it from you." Ningshuama's figure rose and jumped down from the carriage. "When did this prince owe you a life?" Ji Yunhao was puzzled. He couldn't help but lift the curtain and stare at her. In the iron cage in the plaza. After Ningshuama replied with these words, she waved a small bag in her hand. "I'll take your snacks. Just treat it as a small compensation for me." She turned around and ran towards the mountain. "Where are you going?" Ji Yunhao looked at the large mountain and his heart sank. He couldn't help but remind her, "That's Heavenly Book Mountain. Magical beasts run amok there. It's not a place you can go. If you don't have anywhere else to go, you can follow this prince." Ningshuama did not stop, nor did she look back. Her qigong was excellent, and in a few moments she was already far away. Now, she and the 6th prince could be considered to be friends. She didn't want to have too much interaction with this prince. Moreover, she had long wanted to explore the Heavenly Book Mountain. This was the perfect opportunity. Firstly, she needed to gather some herbs that couldn't be bought on the market, and she needed them urgently. Secondly, this place was dangerous, so she could avoid the pursuit of the emperor's soldiers. It was said that even the imperial guards did not dare to set foot on this mountain. It would be just right for her to go back after 2 or 3 days of collecting herbs here. It wouldn't delay anything. Ji Yunhao looked at her back as it quickly disappeared into the horizon. He felt a sense of loss in his heart. A question flashed through his mind. Although he had let her down in the iron cage in the square, he had not taken her life, right? Why did she say that she still owed her a life? "Master, did she poison you just now? Do you know how to detoxify the poison?" An imperial guard reminded him. Ji Yunhao finally remembered the pill she gave him. His heart sank. This little girl said that if he didn't take the antidote for a day, he would die. She wouldn't really want to kill him, right? His figure rose, but he suddenly felt something in his sleeve. He reached out and took out a purple-red pill. There were 2 words engraved on the pill. Antidote. The imperial guard was not at ease. "This pill's composition is unknown. Why don't you go to the town ahead and find a doctor to examine it?" Chapter 128. No need. Ji Yunhao raised his hand and placed the pill into his mouth, swallowing it. A warm current flowed down his throat, finally dispelling the cold feeling that the previous pill gave him. He snickered in his heart. Although this little girl was smart, she was still too young and didn't think things through. If she gave him the antidote now, wasn't she afraid that he would immediately send people to capture her? Or that he would leak her whereabouts to other soldiers? In the end, this little girl was still too inexperienced. He sat down and began to circulate the antidote. After a while, he felt his entire body heat up. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead and his entire body was burning up. His mouth was also dry and there was a bitter taste. What was going on? Was this the normal reaction of the antidote or? He was so hot that he couldn't help but raise his hand to take off his outer robe. He didn't expect that a slip of paper would fall from his outer robe. This slip of paper was placed in a very good position. If he didn't take off his outer robe, this slip of paper wouldn't have fallen out. There was only a short line of words on the slip of paper. This antidote can suppress the poison for 5 days. After 5 days, come to Marquis Jingyuan's estate, and the real antidote will be delivered. Ji Yunhao. This cunning little girl. She was simply a fox reincarnated. Ji Yunhao didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He was both angry and amused. After thinking for a bit, he ordered number 2 follow her and make sure she is safe. Number 2 was somewhat puzzled. This little girl had schemed against His Highness so many times. Shouldn't His Highness hate her to the point of gnashing his teeth? Him not making things worse for her was already giving her face. Why did he still want to protect her? Ji Yunhao saw the doubt in number 2's eyes and lightly said, "This prince doesn't want her to die. She still hasn't given me the real antidote." This time, number 2 understood and immediately bowed, "Yes, master." He turned around and chased after Ning Xuema. "You only need to secretly protect her. Unless there is no other choice, don't show yourself." Ji Yunhao instructed again. "Understood." Number 2 didn't waste any words. His figure flashed and he chased after Ning Xuema. Number 1 looked at Ji Yunhao with a complicated gaze. His Highness seemed to treat this little girl in a special way. He chose this time to leave the house especially to send this little girl off. Otherwise, he wouldn't have prepared clothes suitable for this little girl in the carriage. Although Ji Yunhao had been demoted, his information network was not the slightest bit blocked. As a prince, and an ambitious one at that, he naturally had a complicated network of connections and information. Everything that happened in the city would be transmitted to Ji Yunhao's ears in a timely manner. The Dali Temple's most famous arresting god led 12 gold medal arresters, riding fast horses and leading hunting dogs. They searched outside the city for an entire night, but they couldn't find even half a corner of Ning Xuema's clothes. Ji Yunhao guessed that Ning Xuema should still be in the city. Therefore, he chose to go out at this time and even made the carriage so ostentatious. "Are you wondering why I want to help her?" Ji Yunhao glanced at his subordinate. This subordinate really doesn't quite understand. Bodyguard number 1 was also straightforward. "I don't want her to enter the harem." Regarding this point, bodyguard number 1 understood. This little girl was mischievous. If she entered the harem, she would definitely be an expert in wielding power. Furthermore, she had some friendship with the crown prince, Ji Yunhuang. If there were any unforeseen events in the harem, she would definitely side with Ji Yunhuang, which would not be beneficial to their 6th master. "I can think of a way to get rid of her." Ji Yunhao secretly rolled his eyes. "Get rid of her? That's easy for you to say. I almost got rid of by her, okay?" You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.